Thank you for your testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. On July 22nd, you joined the President as he announced the expansion of Operation Legend, an initiative... Let me start that again. On July 22nd, you joined the President as he announced the expansion of Operation Legend, an initiative to combat violent crime in Kansas City, with approximately $61 million in DOJ grants. I am confused, however, as to the purpose of launching Operation Legend at this moment in time. In December of last year, you announced that the department would divert over $70 million in grants to 7 U.S. cities under an initiative called Operation Relentless Pursuit, correct?
That's right.
And Operation Relentless Pursuit targeted a familiar list of cities, places like Albuquerque, Baltimore, and Kansas City, correct?
Correct.
At the same July 22nd press conference, you initially claimed that over 200 arrests had been made under Operation Legend, correct?
Correct.
But you misspoke.
Correct.
The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Missouri later confirmed that only a single arrest had been made under the auspices of Operation Legend, correct?
I don't know.
And the 199 other arrests were made under Relentless Pursuit or other programs. Well, that was correct. I think you could be forgiven for being confused. Operation Legend appears to be little more than a repackaging of existing operations in these cities. So why all the drama? Why join the President at the White House to announce a bold new operation that appears to be neither bold nor new? Understandably, Americans are very suspicious of your motives here. There are those who believe you are sending federal law enforcement into these cities not to combat violent crime, but to help with the President's re-election efforts. The President has made clear that he wants conflict between protesters and police to be a central theme of his campaign. So let me ask you directly, Mr. Barr. Yes or no? Yes or no? Did you rebrand existing projects under the Legend in order to assist the President in an election year?
I wouldn't call it.
Mr. Attorney General, would you agree with me, at least on principle, that it is improper for the Department of Justice to divert resources and law enforcement personnel in an effort to assist the President's re-election campaign?
No, Mr. Chairman, in the fall, we did inaugurate an anti-crime initiative because we were concerned about increasing violent crime in a number of cities, and we called that Relentless Pursuit. Unfortunately, COVID intervened, and our agents who were detailed for these assignments could not perform the operation. So the operation was squelched by COVID. So we couldn't complete or make much progress on Relentless Pursuit. However, in the intervening time, we saw violent crime continuing to rise, and a lot of that was triggered by the events after the death of George Floyd. So we did reboot the program after COVID started breaking and we could commit the law enforcement resources to actually accomplish the mission, which is to reduce violent crime. Now, I regret that COVID interrupted our law enforcement activities, but it doesn't obviate the fact that there is serious violent crime in these cities. These police departments and mayors have been asking us for help, and we have put in additional federal agents and investigators to help deal with it.
Have you, now, yes or no, have you discussed the President's re-election campaign with the President or with any White House official or any surrogate of the President?
Well, I'm not going to get into my discussions with the President.
Well, have you discussed that topic with him, yes or no?
Not in relation to this program.
I didn't ask that. I asked if you discussed that with...
I'm a member of the cabinet and there's an election going on. Obviously, the topic comes up.
So the answer is yes.
Well, the topic comes up in cabinet meetings and other things. It shouldn't be a
surprise
that the topic of the election.
I didn't say I was surprised. I just asked if you'd done that. So as part of those conversations with the President or his people about the re-election campaign, have you ever discussed the current or future deployment of federal law enforcement?
In connection with what?
In connection with what you just said, in connection with your discussions with the President or with other people around him of his re-election campaign, have you discussed the current or future deployment of federal law
Well,
enforcement.
as I say, I'm not going to get into my discussions with the president, but I've made it clear that I would like to pick the cities based on law enforcement need and based on neutral
So,
criteria.
but you can't tell me whether you discussed.
No, I'm not going to discuss what I discussed with the
Can
president.
you commit today that the department will not use federal law enforcement as a prop in the president's reelection campaign?
We are not using
I just want to
federal law
close
enforcement.
with this thought. You really can't hide behind legal fictions this time, Mr. Barr. It's all out in the open, where the people can see what you are doing for themselves. The president wants footage for his campaign ads, and you appear to be serving it up to him as ordered. In most of these cities, the protests had begun to wind down before you marched in and confronted the protesters. And the protesters aren't mobs. They are mothers and veterans and mayors. In this moment, real leadership would entail de-escalation, collaboration, and looking for ways to peaceably resolve our differences. Instead, you use pepper spray and truncheons on American citizens. You did it here in Washington. You did it at Lafayette Square. You expanded to Portland. And now you are projecting fear and violence nationwide in pursuit of obvious political objectives. Shame on you, Mr. Barr.
Can I just say, Mr.
Shame on you.
Can I just
My
say,
time
Mr.
has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition? Mr. Excuse me.
Could I just
What
have a
purpose
moment?
does Mr. My time has expired. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Questions for the witness, and I will yield the floor to him to respond.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, you've conflated two different things. The effort, like legend, is to deal with violent crime that's committing on the streets of the city. Again, predatory violence like murder, shootings, which are soaring in some cities right now. That does not involve encountering protesters, as you refer to it. Civil disturbance is a different set of issues. And I just reject the idea that the department has flooded anywhere and attempted to suppress demonstrators. We make a clear distinction between demonstrators.
The facts speak for themselves.
This is my time, Mr.
I'm
Chairman.
answering, and you know, the fact of the matter is, if you take Portland, the courthouse is under attack. The federal resources are inside the perimeter around the courthouse, defending it from almost 2 months of daily attacks where people march to the court, try to gain entrance, and have set fires, thrown things, used explosives, and injured police, including just this past weekend, perhaps permanently blinding 3 federal officers with lasers. We are on the defense. We're not out looking for trouble. And if the state and the city would provide the law enforcement services that other jurisdictions do, we would have no need to have additional marshals in the courthouse.
Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, it's obvious what is happening here from the video played during the ranking member's opening remarks. It's clear that the president's playbook is to divert attention from his catastrophic failure in dealing with the COVID-19 situation. In Canada, our neighbor to the north, in Europe, the virus has been reduced to such a level that people can safely go out and not worry about being infected. But here in the United States, millions of Americans have been infected. Tens of thousands are dying, and the president needs to divert from that failure. And what is the playbook? The playbook is to create the impression that there is violence, that he must send in federal troops, and that the American people should be afraid of other Americans and trust the president because he's going to send in all troops to American cities. And that's how he hopes to win the election. You know, it's one thing to fight crime with joint task forces. That involves the cooperation of state and local officials. But the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland has asked that the federal troops leave because the reaction has actually been in reverse proportion. People are showing up because the troops are there. And I'd like to say that so many of them, I would say most of them, are nonviolent. We've all heard about the wall of moms who show up to make sure that people are safe. And here's what they say. They say they've been tear gassed night after night, left vomiting, that they've been shot at with rubber bean bags, pepper spray. So this brutality has created even more demonstrators. I'd just like to ask you this. When the president issued his executive order, they indicated your department should prioritize investigations. Has your department started any investigations pursuant to the executive order that the president issued?
Which executive order, Congresswoman?
The executive order that asked for the deployment of troops to protect the monuments and the federal facilities
Yes,
on June 26th.
yeah, I wouldn't say it was troops, but we have initiated investigations, yes. We've made arrests of people who have been rioting and taken down statues. But I think your characterization of Portland is completely false.
I would like to, we can get into that, but I'd like to ask you a question about surveillance, if I may. We've heard reports that cell site stimulators known as stingrays or dirt boxes are being used to collect phone call location and even content of phone calls. Drones are being used that may have facial recognition or cell phone interception technology, and that there is bulk collection of internet browsing history. What specific authority is the department using for these surveillance tools?
I really can't speak to those instances if they in fact occurred. I'm glad to go and try to determine what you're talking about.
Well, actually, I'm asking about authority, not the details.
Well, I think most of our cyber activities are conducted by the FBI under their law enforcement powers to detect and prevent crime, federal crime.
I think the American public should know that this surveillance technique isn't just about the people in front of the courthouse. If a husband and wife call each other and one of the spouses has a cell phone that's within range of one of these technologies, not only the location, but the actual content of that couple's conversation can be scooped up using this technology. So this really isn't just about the people demonstrating. This is about the privacy of all Americans, and it's all being violated for the president's political purposes of trying to create a scene, create a reason, divert attention from the COVID failure. I think it's really very unfortunate and a disservice to the American people. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. So
The
Point of order, Mr.
gentlelady
Chairman.
yields back.
Mr. Chairman, point of order, real quick.
Gentleman will state his point of order.
Could you ask those members who choose not to come to work to silence their cell phones on the video because it's distracting to what we're doing here
That
today?
is not a point of order. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, before I begin, I'd like to submit into the record a picture of Lewis and Clark History Department chair shot at protests in Portland. Ask unanimous consent. Place that into the record. John Lewis in 1963 said, "We are tired about being beat by police. We're tired of being put in jail. We want our freedom now." Mr. Attorney General, in your remarks, you indicated that we made great progress since that time, and you indicated that the killing of George Floyd was shocking. I disagree. It was outright cold-blooded murder on the streets of America, unfortunately by police misconduct. You seem to have a difficult time understanding systemic racism and institutional racism that has plagued so many. Mr. Attorney General, do you understand a black mother's or parent's talk to their child, to their son? Do you know what that is?
I think I do.
I don't know if you do, but Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Sean Bell, and George Floyd. Black mothers and fathers have had to talk to their sons about police violence. I take no backseat to the history of this committee that has stood for good policing, not misconduct. And so I ask you this question: does the Trump Justice Department seek to end systemic racism and racism in law enforcement? I just need a yes or no answer.
To the extent there is racism in any of our institutions in this country and the police, then obviously this administration will fully enforce this.
So you agree that there may be systemic
To
racism?
the extent, in where?
Let me continue my line of
I
questioning.
don't agree that there's systemic racism in the police department.
Specifically,
Generally in this country.
I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. General. Specifically, do you understand the violent impact of racial profiling? And do you support the end racial profiling, racial and religious profiling in the George Floyd bill, including the removal of the strict interpretation of qualified immunity, which would leave individuals like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd without any relief at all?
No, I'm opposed to eliminating qualified immunity, and I don't agree that it would leave the victims of police misconduct
Well, let me share with you some aspects.
without any remedy at all.
I'm reclaiming my time. Let me share with you some aspects of profiling. After the death of George Floyd found that while black people make up 19% of the Minneapolis population and 9% of its police, they were on the receiving end of 58% of the city's police use of force incidents. In addition, we've seen that black men are twice as likely to be stopped and searched, Hispanic drivers 65% to receive a ticket, and Native Americans in Arizona 3 times more likely to search and be stopped. Let me ask you the questions of how we respond to that. The Justice Department has many tools at its disposal to reduce police violence, to pattern or practice investigations, a practice to end bad policing and police violence. It addresses police violence at an institution level rather than just focuses on acute cases. If you understand that, then why has your department only pursued one pattern or practice investigation since President Trump took office that could stop systemic racism?
If you read my statement or listened to my statement, I did specifically acknowledge that there was a difficulty in this country with the African American community.
Mr. Attorney General, I have short time.
Well,
Can you just
I'd
tell
like
me
to be
why
able
you
to
have not
answer
done a
question.
pattern in practice? What was the reason?
And you asked me what I thought the response was, and I thought the response to this is, in fact, training of police, and I think the police believe that that's a response. I was talking to a black
Then let me
chief of
continue.
police.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to respect you, but I have a short time. For example, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, which makes unlawful the denial of rights under the color of law. Can you defend the fact that in the first 7 months of FY 2020, federal prosecutors filed only 242 charges in just 27 cases in the Trump DOJ? And were you aware that in FY 2019, federal prosecutors brought Section 242 charges in just 49 cases in the United States? And are you aware of how many cases we've had? 184,274, which means that in FY 2019, only about 27 out of every 100,000 prosecutions was related to Section 242 charges. Do you have a reason for that?
Yes, I do. I will get you the numbers on it. I don't know them off the top of my head, but actually our criminal prosecutions under 241 and 242 are extremely strong and are comparable to, if not exceed, prior administrations. But at the beginning of this year, very few jurisdictions had grand juries that were open. No grand juries.
I think the reason is because it was really skinny. It was not your focus. Your focus was more to let out friends like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, while Tamir Rice, whose case has not been taken up, was playing with a toy gun, was killed by police at the age of 12. Breonna Taylor was sleeping in her apartment when she was killed by police at age 26. And Rashad Brooks, 27, was killed just for sleeping in his car in a Wendy's parking lot. And George Floyd from Houston, Texas, known as a humble man, was murdered in the streets of Minneapolis crying, "I can't breathe." I would hope that the DOJ would focus on systemic institutional racism because there is good policing. That's what we're trying to do in the Judiciary Committee, and that's what we need you to join us on, Mr. Attorney General, and to recognize that institutional racism does exist, and until we accept that, we will not finish our job and reach the goals and aspirations of our late iconic John Lewis. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Barr, I'm the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, so this is most pertinent hearing to me. Firstly, I'd like to ask you if you will work with us and allow the head of the Civil Rights Division, Assistant Attorney General Eric Dryband, to testify before this committee this fall.
I'll talk to him about it.
We encourage him.
I'll talk to him about it.
All right. I've closely watched actions taken by the federal government in Lafayette Park in June and currently in Portland, Oregon. According to a DOJ document dated June 4, received by this committee, 1,500 federal agents from 10 different agencies were deployed to confront protesters in Washington, D.C. At Lafayette Park, which has long been honored and accepted as a place of protest in our nation's capital, on the first day of June, the world watched in horror on live television as federal agents deployed by the administration and with you present and telling him to get it done, used force to clear Lafayette Park so that the president, with you and others at your side, could walk across the park and have a photo op in front of St. John's Church. This was anathema to the bishop of the diocese and the rector of the church. It was also an affront to the Constitution and to the American people. Given the timing and the coordinated attack against the peaceful demonstrators, it strains credulity that this was not planned for use of political purposes. And just yesterday, Major DeMarco testified to another committee of Congress that the protesters were peaceful, and that's what the majority of people have said, and the response was excessive. When did you first learn that the president planned to walk through the park and go to St. John's Church?
First, I'd like to respond to what you...
Would you please answer my question? My time is limited.
I learned sometime in the afternoon that the president might come out of the White House, and then later in the afternoon I heard that he might go over to the church.
So it was absolutely necessary the park be cleared for his walk.
No, that had nothing to do with that. The plan to move...
Mr.
plan to
Attorney General,
move the
it was
perimeter to
necessary that the
ice
park be cleared, and it was done, and you said, get it done.
Well,
I have the time, thank you. In Portland, we've seen mothers and we've seen veterans who were peacefully protesting, not threatening the federal courthouse, beaten and gassed. Unidentified armed federal agents violently attacked demonstrators in a violation of the First Amendment's freedom of assembly and arrested citizens without individualized suspicion in a violation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and a warrant requirement. You've gone through the Fifth Amendment and due process and just negated it. And the 10th Amendment, which leaves general policing to the law enforcement, to the states, has been forgotten. Maybe what happened was your secret police were poorly trained, just like your Bureau of Prisons guards were poorly trained and allowed the most notorious inmate in our nation's last several years, Jeffrey Epstein, to conveniently commit suicide. Sad. You misled Congress and the American people about Special Counsel Mueller's findings with your, quote, summary, unquote, of his report. It was issued about a month before you released the redacted portion of the Mueller report. But you set the stage. You set the stage such that the Special Counsel objected to the accuracy of how it was reported by the press and what you said. And federal judge Reggie Walton, appointed by George W. Bush, declared in a ruling that your summary was, quote, distorted, unquote, and misleading, unquote, and that the court could not trust you. Further, Judge Walton stated your report was, quote, a calculated attempt to influence public disclosure about the Mueller report in favor of President Trump, unquote. This committee still does not have the unredacted Mueller report. America has still not seen the unredacted Mueller report. Your excuses for not releasing it because it had to do with ongoing cases no longer exist because those ongoing cases have been completed or commuted or finished. Other attorney generals work with this Judiciary Committee to see that the American public and that the Judiciary Committee had unredacted copies of that report. You have not. You've gone to court to stall it. This report needs to be given to this committee. In Michael Cohen, you've treated him differently than Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. In Michael Flynn, you've attempted to dismiss the charges, even after he twice pled guilty. And in Roger Stone, you went further. Mr. Barr, John Lewis said to us, if not me, who? If not now, when? That's why I introduced H.Res. 1032, which would require this committee to investigate your conduct as Attorney General and determine whether you should be impeached. That is my constitutional duty. I yield back the balance of my time.
May I respond to these?
I seek recognition.
I'm sorry, what did you?
I would
the
like to,
chair
I would like to
recognizes Mr.
seek
Cohen.
recognition for unanimous consent requests.
Yes, you are
Thank you.
recognized.
I'd like to introduce for the record a Slate article entitled Why Trump Chose Portland, which describes the racial history of the state and the Portland Police Bureau. I'd also like to introduce an op-ed from Mary McCord, who writes her words were twisted to justify the department's disingenuous position to drop charges against Michael Flynn after he had already pled guilty. I'd like to introduce an op-ed from Jonathan Kravis, describing the political interference in the Roger Stone case and why he resigned from the Department of Justice. And I'd like to introduce a statement from over 2,600 former DOJ officials calling for Attorney General Barr's resignation because of his assault on the rule of law, and a letter from the New York City Bar urging Congress to commence formal inquiries into a pattern of conduct by Attorney General Barr that threatens public confidence in the fair and impartial administration of justice. And finally, a letter from 27 of the District of Columbia's most prominent attorneys and law professors, including 4 past presidents of the D.C. Bar, calling for an ethics investigation into Mr. Barr's conduct. And
With that
last but not
objection.
least, a letter from over 80% of the George Washington University Law School faculty, your alma mater, saying his actions have posed and continue to create a clear and present danger to the even-handed administration of justice, to civil liberties, and to the constitutional order.
Okay, without objection.
Madam Chair, one more
The-
unanimous consent request on this
Go
side.
ahead.
This is the article that says Representative Jerry Nadler says Antifa violence in Portland is a myth. That's from Politico and a number of other journals. We put that
Without
in the record.
objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Johnson from Georgia.
Thank you. General Barr, your opening statement reads like it was written by Alex Jones or Roger Stone. Do you
Oh.
stand by that statement?
Yes.
Now, I'm sure that we can agree on some things. We disagree on a whole lot, but I'm sure we can agree on the fact that President Trump is just a prolific tweeter. Isn't that correct?
He seems to be.
And he tweeted many times about the Roger Stone sentencing, didn't he?
I don't know how many times he tweeted about it.
Well, many times, you are aware of them because you said it hurts you from doing your job. And isn't it true that when prosecutors in the Roger Stone case filed a memo with the court recommending a sentence of 7 to 9 years in prison, a few hours later, President Trump tweeted that the sentence recommendation was, quote, a disgrace? You're aware of that?
Yes.
And General Barr, several hours after that, you filed a pleading with the court stating that the sentence recommendation would be changed and that you would be asking for a lighter sentence for Roger Stone. Isn't that correct?
No, what is correct is that,
Well, I mean-
what is correct that on February 10th, Monday,
No,
I gave
no, no, no.
instructions as to what
Reclaiming
the,
my time.
yeah,
reclaiming
I'm
my
answering
time.
your question.
Well, you gotta let him answer.
Reclaiming my time, you filed a sentencing recommendation hours after President Trump tweeted his dissatisfaction with the Stone recommendation, and you changed that recommendation.
No, the
several
night
hours after
the night before, that is
Well,
Monday
I
night.
know your story, but I'm asking.
Well, I'm telling my story. That's what
Well,
I'm
I
here
don't
to
want you
do.
to tell your
Well, I
story. I
do.
want
That's
you to
why I'm
answer my
here.
question.
Well, I'm here to tell my story.
Well,
And on the night
You're here to
before,
answer my
the
question.
night before, on February
No,
10th,
sir.
on February
I'm
10th, I
reclaiming-
directed-
Reclaiming my time, sir. Reclaiming my time. And I know you don't want to answer, but the facts are clear. Sentencing recommendation made in the morning, tweet in the afternoon, you changed the sentencing recommendation that.
no, tweet was not made in the
after tweet.
afternoon. The tweet was made at, I think, 1:30 or 2 in the morning.
Well, the tweet was made before and after. Tweeted about that relentlessly, and you've agreed to that. Now, when you filed your sentencing recommendation asking for a lower sentence,
I didn't ask for a lower sentence.
well, you said that you were going to recommend a lower sentence, and you
No,
wasn't the sentence that was recommended by the line prosecutors
Ex-
according to the sentencing guideline calculations?
It was within the guidelines, but it was not within Justice
So-
Department policy,
So
in my
now,
view.
General Barr, you're expecting the American people to believe that you did not do what Trump wanted you to do when you changed that sentencing recommendation and lowered it for Roger Stone. You think the American people don't understand that you were carrying out Trump's
I was not,
Bill?
I had not discussed my sentencing recommendation with anyone at the White House or
Doing what the
anyone,
President exactly.
or anyone
doing what
outside the
President
department.
wanted you to do. And that's what you did.
No.
Attorney
Let me ask you, do you think it's fair? Do you think it is fair for a 67-year-old man to be sent to prison for 7 to 9 years?
It was in accordance with the sentencing.
No, it was not.
You just said that it was, and your line prosecutors will testify that it was also. Now, I'm going to move on from that.
The department,
During your time as Attorney
It is
General
not the
for Herbert Walker Bush, you never changed the sentencing recommendation for a friend of Herbert Walker Bush, did you?
no, as I recall.
All right, that's all
it's-
I'm
no,
asking. No. And over the course of your time as Trump,
Nothing was never elevated to me.
over the course of your tenure with Trump, you've changed 2 sentencing recommendations, not 1, but 2. Correct?
Which were they?
Yeah, Michael Flynn.
I didn't change it.
Well, you said, well, you indicated that you changed it because the original Flynn sentencing recommendation was for Flynn to serve 0 to 6 months. But under your authority, the Justice Department supplemented that recommendation with a pleading that stated the Department of Justice's agreement with Flynn's lawyers that probation would be a reasonable sentence and that the DOJ would not be seeking prison time for Michael Flynn. Isn't that correct?
I don't think that's what it said.
Well, that's what it said, sir. You go back and read it.
I
Now,
think both pleadings
Now, sir,
said that.
reclaiming my time, prior to you
The
becoming
gentleman's
attorney-
time
Chair.
has expired.
Madam Chair, you can give a speech or you can ask questions. If you do the latter, you need to let the witness answer the questions. And that's the chair's obligation,
And I
chair's
believe-
responsibility to allow that to happen.
The chair recognizes Mr. Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Attorney General Barr, you just told us that nothing was ever elevated to me. You had said in an interview recently that there's a process in place, an escalation system. It's the AG's responsibility to resolve it. How was this elevated to you, the case of Roger Stone?
On Monday, February 10th, the U.S. Attorney was with me, and he raised the issue with me.
So it was elevated by Timothy Shea.
Yes.
And had it been elevated during the 2 months between the time the conviction came in under the former U.S. Attorney and the time that Timothy Shea started?
I think Shea may have had conversations with people in the.
Did you ever have conversations with a former U.S. Attorney about this case? About the sentencing?
Stone? I don't recall any discussion about Stone with.
Right.
with-
So Timothy Shea, you said in the interview that he was new, he had just started. He was new, but he worked for you for a long time, didn't he?
Yes.
And what was his job for you?
Well, when I was Attorney General 30 years ago, he worked.
No, now, just now.
He was on my staff.
He advised you on criminal justice policy and law enforcement, right?
Correct.
And you named him acting U.S. Attorney. Had you discussed the Stone case with him before you named him acting U.S. Attorney?
No.
Did you discuss sentencing with him? Not before. The first time was when he came in. It wasn't Monday, actually. Just to refresh your recollection, in a prior interview, you said he came in the week before. He came in to see some senior staff. That's what you.
No, that's what I said. He may have had discussions with people in the deputy's office. I was not involved in those discussions. Basically, I didn't, as far as I can recall, I had no substantive involvement in Stone until that Monday when he came in the morning.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Attorney General, the week before when he came in to see the senior staff that he had worked with the week before when he was working on
No,
your
I
staff.
said I think he had raised it with people in the deputy's office. That's senior staff too.
Right,
The
I
department
understand.
does it. But I was not involved.
He started on July 31st. The first week he was there, he came to raise this issue.
I think he started February 1st.
Right. The first week he was there, he came into your office to raise the issue of sentencing. In the interview you did with ABC, you said you
No,
never.
I don't think he came.
That's what you told ABC News. You said that he's talked to senior staff, not you perhaps, but he talked to senior staff. I
don't know what, I think I speak English. I said that before he came in to see me, I believe he had some conversation.
Conversations with senior staff, right, that's right, before he came to
Okay.
see you. We're saying the same thing.
But the first it was raised with me.
Was on Monday.
Was on Monday.
Did you talk to the senior staff after they spoke with him?
I think at a 9 o'clock meeting, they said that he was trying to work something out on sentencing, and he was actually optimistic that something could be worked out. So I didn't really think of it as an issue until that Monday, when he told me that
Right,
the
so
line
then
prosecutors.
So then he filed the sentencing memo, and the sentencing memo called for 7 to 9 years. It's the policy of the U.S. Attorney's Office to suggest a specific guideline range, which they did, and then you overruled the line prosecutors. They asked for a lower sentence, and you gave some reasons. You talked about health. Health is to be considered only for an extraordinary physical impairment. Did that apply to Roger Stone, Mr. Attorney General? That's what the guideline said.
Well, actually, I can't, I can't reveal all the information.
I'm not asking what his health was, but did that apply?
No.
Okay, and did
what apply?
his health? Was that the reason?
Health is a reason to.
I know. Is that
take
the
into
case? Is that the reason for Roger Stone?
That
Where
was-
you're asking for a lower sentence? Let me go on. It says
I
age.
stated why.
Let me go on.
No,
Let me go on.
I stated
Age.
why I felt.
Hold on one second. Age can be consideration. It says only if it creates conditions that are of an unusual degree and distinguish the case from typical cases. He was 67. Did
The
that
judge
apply to him?
agreed with me, Congressman.
No, that's
The
not what I'm
judge
asking.
agreed
I'm
with
not
me.
asking you that.
The
Mr.
judge
Attorney.
agreed with
I'm
me.
not asking whether.
I know you're not
I'm not
asking,
asking
and
you that.
I'm
And
saying.
the issue here is whether Roger Stone was treated differently because he was friends with the president. When you asked to reduce the sentence, you said enhancements were technically applicable. Mr. Attorney General, can you think of any other cases where the defendant threatened to kill a witness, threatened a judge, lied to a judge, where the Department of Justice claimed that those were mere technicalities? Can you think of even one?
The judge agreed with our analysis.
Can you think of even one? I'm not asking about the judge, I'm asking about what you did to reduce the sentence of Roger Stone.
yes.
Can you think,
There
Mr.
are-
Attorney General, he threatened the life of a witness.
And the witness said he
And you view
didn't
that
feel
as a
threatened.
technicality, Mr. Attorney General. Is
witness-
there another time
Can I
when
answer the
that has
question?
happened?
Can I have just a few seconds to answer
Sure,
the question?
I'm asking if there's
Okay.
another time in
this
all the
case,
time of the Justice
the
Department.
judge, the judge agreed
You
with
won't
our.
answer my question,
The
Mr.
judge
Attorney
agreed
General,
with
and
our-
it's unfortunate. And the appearance is that, as you said earlier, this is exactly what you want. The essence of rule of law is that we have one rule for everybody, and we
That's right.
don't in this case because he's a friend of the president's. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mrs. Bass?
Attorney General Barr, when it comes to police engagement, last August, when speaking to the National Fraternal Order of Police, you shared your views on police engagement with the public. You stated, and I quote, "Underscore the need to comply first, and if warranted, complain later. This will make everyone safe, the police, suspects, and the community at large, and those who resist must be prosecuted. I repeat, zero tolerance for resisting police. This will save lives." Do you stand by that statement?
Yes, I think it's very important that
A zero tolerance attitude is costing lives, not saving them, especially in communities of
Well,
color.
I'm not saying that.
I reclaim my time. A movement and protests have arisen in response to police brutality. Here are a few examples of who bears the cost of zero tolerance. Elijah McClain was walking home from a convenience store when he was approached by police. He had not committed a crime. Police held him in a chokehold for 15 minutes, then injected him with ketamine, not under a doctor's supervision, but at the direction of non-medically trained and unlicensed police officers. Are you familiar with that case?
No.
Do you know how frequently ketamine is used by law enforcement to subdue civilians, especially people of color?
No.
Did you know if police departments have been documented as directing paramedics and EMTs to eject ketamine during arrests?
No.
Well then, I guess you haven't evaluated the use of force tactics since becoming AG, and especially this particular tactic of subduing suspects with ketamine.
Not with respect to ketamine, no.
Will you commit to directing the department to evaluate the protocols around the use of ketamine, chokeholds, and other methods used by federal law enforcement officials when making arrests or detaining subjects?
Well, absolutely, under the president's executive order, we are reviewing
Thank you, and
use
especially,
of force and working
Good.
with police departments.
especially the ketamine. That's
I'll look
pretty
into the ketamine.
outrageous. George Floyd was killed by a police officer via a chokehold. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a police officer knelt on his neck as he begged for his life. He was suspected of using a counterfeit $20 bill. That's how zero tolerance can amount to a death sentence for black men when used in communities of color. With George Floyd screaming, as we all know, he couldn't breathe. Now consider James Holmes, who murdered 12 people and injured 70 others in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, the same town as Elijah McClain, where he was arrested. James wore body armor, had a knife, semi-automatic weapons, and an AR-15. Yet he was calmly arrested by the same police department as Elijah McClain without a chokehold or an injection of ketamine. Dylan Roof used a gun to murder 9 people and injured another at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina. When he was arrested, no chokeholds, no injections, he was treated so well that officers brought Dylan Roof Burger King after arresting him. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes.
I raised those 2 examples to follow up on what my colleague from Texas highlighted earlier, that the department is not doing enough to address issues of racism, bias, and brutality in law enforcement. When someone who commits mass murder is calmly arrested and served Burger King, while a young man walking down the street is placed in a chokehold and injected with ketamine, then dies. You said that under the executive order, the administration is looking at chokeholds. What have you determined so far?
Well, we're setting up a system of certification of police departments, and part of what our charter is to come up with criteria that will be used for certification, including limitations on use of force, specifically including chokeholds.
So in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, part of it called for a national registry of law enforcement officers as a resource for police chiefs to determine who are the best candidates for jobs. As you may or may not be aware, Tamir Rice might be alive today if the police chief who hired him had known that that police officer had been fired from another department. What is your view of a national registry of law enforcement officers?
The second aspect of the president's executive order is to set up a database like that so that all determinations of excessive force around the country go into that database, and if police departments aren't reporting that information, they wouldn't be certified. So we do believe in one national point where you can go in and get determinations of excessive force on law enforcement candidates for jobs.
Good, thank you. And I do want to comment on part of your opening statement when you were saying that after the Jim Crow period, that our justice system was equal. And I don't believe that that's the case.
I said the laws were made equal.
The laws are made equal. They are certainly not applied equally. We do have systemic problems in our law enforcement system, our criminal justice system on every level. The fact of the matter is 2.3 million people in the United States are incarcerated. We incarcerate 24% of the world's prisoners. 34% are black, while African Americans are just 13% of the U.S. population. So justice is still not equal, nor are our laws. And I think when we look at how many people are incarcerated or how many people are killed, it is not the numbers, it is the percentage to the percentage of that group in the U.S. population. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Barr, you started your testimony with eloquent words about the life and legacy of John Lewis, fighting systematic racism, voter intimidation, civil rights. The one thing that you have in common with your 2 predecessors, both Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Whitaker, is that when you all came here and brought your top staff, you brought no black people. That, sir, is systematic racism. That is exactly what John Lewis spent his life fighting. And so I would just suggest that actions speak louder than words, and you really should keep the name of the Honorable John Lewis out of the Department of Justice's mouth. Let me also say you mentioned bogus Russiagate. In your opinion, as the Attorney General of the United States of America, did Russia interfere or attempt to interfere in the 2016 election?
Yes.
In your position as the Attorney General of the United States, is Russia attempting to interfere in the 2020 presidential election?
I think we have to assume that they are.
Thank you, sir. Now, let's talk about the integrity of the election, which is also something Congressman Lewis fought for. Jared Kushner implied that the president could move the election day. Can a sitting U.S. president move an election day?
Actually, I haven't looked into that question under the Constitution.
Well, 2 U.S. Code Section 7 says federal election day is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if you take that as a correct statute, is there any executive action by a president?
I've never been asked the question before. I've never looked into it.
As Attorney General of the United States, do you believe that this 2020 presidential election will be rigged?
I have no reason to think it will be.
President Trump tweeted that the election will be rigged, but he also tweeted that when he was losing to Hillary Clinton, and he tweeted that the day after Fox showed that he was losing to Trump. But I don't want to be too political. Do you believe, as the Attorney General of the United States, that mail-in voting will lead to massive voter fraud?
I think there's a high risk that it will.
Do you ever vote by mail-in ballot?
Apparently I did once at least.
But you believe that other people voting by mail could lead to massive fraud?
No, what I've talked about, made very clear, is that I'm not talking about accommodations to people who have to be out of the state or have some particular need not to, inability to go and vote. What I'm talking about is the wholesale conversion of election to mail-in voting.
You do understand that African Americans disproportionately do not survive COVID-19 coronavirus. You are aware of that?
I didn't hear the question.
You are aware that African Americans, black people, disproportionately die from COVID-19 coronavirus, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
And not that it would be the first time that African Americans would risk their lives to vote in this country to preserve its democracy. But the suggestion is that them having the ability to vote by mail would somehow lead to massive voter fraud, but I won't stick to that.
No, I didn't say that. I just state, I think, what is a reality, which is that if you have wholesale mail-in voting, it substantially increases the risk of fraud.
But it doesn't make it likely.
That's all I said.
Now, I also saw on TV that the president said he's not sure that he'll accept the election results. Can a president just protest because he lost an election?
Protest in what sense?
Well, can he contest an election just because he simply loses?
Well, Gore versus, Bush v. Gore was.
Well, I think that was over a slim voter margin. I'm talking about if it is very clear that the president has lost an election, does he have a remedy to contest the election?
Not that I'm aware of.
Let me go back to what Representative Bass mentioned. You mentioned the number that there were 8 African Americans killed by the police and 11 white people killed by the police.
So far this year.
If you use those numbers, that's 85% of that population is white, 15% of that population is black. But if you actually look at the deaths, according to the numbers you just gave, 42% of the deaths are African American and 58% are white. That is a glaring disparity in terms of population, and I just give you those numbers.
Well, not necessarily.
Because
you
I
have to adjust it by the race of the criminal perpetrator.
No, I just did that for you. I'm using your numbers, and according to your numbers, African Americans are 4 or 5 times more likely than their percentage of the population to be killed by police than their white counterparts. I just wanted to give you that based on your numbers.
Actually, the studies I've seen have suggested 2 things. One, that in fact, police are less likely to shoot at a black suspect, a little bit more likely to shoot at white. However, that police are more inclined to use non-lethal force in a contact with an African-American suspect. So those are in terms of the statistics, that's what it looks like to me.
Any data that you have that shows that African Americans are less likely to die at the hands of police or be shot or shot at, to me, is a incorrect analysis. But I am interested in seeing it. So if you have it, please see it. I won't call it any names. But if that data exists, I would be more than happy to see it. And since you're sending me that data, can you send me the data of African Americans within the Department of Justice? How many you have in leadership ranks all the way down? Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I would remind Mr. Jordan, Mr. Biggs, and Mr. Johnson to stop violating the rules of the committee, to stop violating the safety of the members of the committee, to stop holding themselves out as not caring by refusing to wear their masks.
Is it permissible to drink, sip
It is
coffee?
not permissible.
Not to drink.
We can't
I'm
drink
getting ready to
coffee
ask
in the
questions now. I'm getting ready to ask questions.
Mr.
And I will.
Unbelievable.
Mr. Gates is recognized.
No, he's
No,
already went.
he went, and that's why I took off my mask,
It's
Mr. Chairman.
It's my turn. I'm going to go.
Okay.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Barr, the job of the Attorney General is to defend the best interests of the people and serve as the people's lawyer. But during your time as Attorney General, you have consistently undermined democracy, undermined the Constitution, and undermined the health, safety, and well-being of the American people, all to personally benefit Donald Trump. Now, you just testified that there's no mechanism for a president to contest an election that has clearly been won by the opponent. Mr. Attorney General, what will you do if Donald Trump loses the election on November 3rd, but refuses to leave office on January 20th?
If the results are clear, I would leave office.
Do you believe that there is any basis or legitimacy to Donald Trump's recent claim that he can't provide an answer as to whether he would leave office?
I really am not familiar with these comments or the context in which they occurred, so I'm not going to give commentary on them.
Okay, thank you. He just stated that publicly about a week ago to Fox News. Mr. Barr, during a radio interview this spring with Hugh Hewitt, you praised President Trump's coronavirus response as superb, correct?
Who did?
You did.
Okay.
Over 150,000 Americans have died. More than 4 million Americans have been infected. More than 5 million Americans have lost their health care. Over 100,000 small businesses have permanently closed. More than 50 million Americans are out of work. This is not the outcome of superb leadership. What we've gotten from Donald Trump is exactly the opposite.
Well,
Let's explore.
Well, I disagree with that.
That was not a question, that was a statement. Let's explore. In February, President Trump falsely claimed that the number of coronavirus cases would go from 15 to 0 in a few days. Was that superb, yes or no?
I'd have to see the context in which it was said.
Here's the context.
Well,
the number of cases didn't go down to 0. It's over 4 million. Let's go to March. In that month, President Trump said, "I take no responsibility at all for the failure in testing." Was that superb, yes or no?
It was accurate. The problem with the testing system was a function of President Obama's mishandling of the CDC and his efforts to centralize everything in the CDC when they didn't have the
Thank you, Mr. Barr. That is inaccurate. That's a myth.
It wasn't until this
That's a lie.
administration. It wasn't
You're
until
claiming my time. In April, President Trump irresponsibly suggested that the American people inject themselves with bleach. Was that superb? Yes or no?
That's not what I heard.
That's exactly what he said. That's what the American people heard, and you know it, and you can't defend it. Let's move on to May. In that month, on National Nurses Day, President Trump falsely called PPE shortages fake news, while nurses and other healthcare professionals resorted to wearing trash bags and ski goggles to protect themselves. Fake news. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think the administration did a good job of mustering PPE, and the national supply of PPE was run down during the Obama administration and never replaced.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. The answer is no, it was not superb. By June, President Trump irresponsibly continued to refuse to wear a mask despite the public health guidance from his own experts. Was that superb? Yes or no?
Which guidance? The earlier guidance that the masks wouldn't work?
You know exactly the guidance that we're talking about. The CDC and Dr. Fauci in April recommended that the American people wear a mask, but Donald Trump has become the poster boy for the anti-mask movement.
Donald Trump has probably tested more than any other human being on the face of the
Yeah,
earth.
Mr. Barr, the answer is the refusal to wear a mask is not superb. Last question. In July, President Trump falsely claimed that 99% of COVID-19 cases are, quote, totally harmless. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I think essentially what he was saying is that the fatality rate relatively is very low, very low.
The answer is 150,000 Americans are dead. It has been a failure of epic proportions. In fact, Donald Trump's response to the coronavirus pandemic has been the worst failure of any president in American history. And the American people have paid the price. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Barr, have you ever intervened other than to help the president's friend get a reduced prison sentence for any other case where a prosecutor had filed a sentencing recommendation with the court?
A sentencing recommendation?
Yeah, have you ever intervened other than that case with the president's friend?
Not that I recall, if you're talking.
Does that seem like something you'd recall, where you would?
Well, I'm saying I can't really remember my first, if you let me finish the question. I
That's
can't
a big
remember.
deal.
30 years ago, I was Attorney General.
As Attorney General now?
No, I didn't. But that's because issues come up to the Attorney General within a dispute. And I have never heard of a dispute. I've never heard of a dispute in the department where
Barr,
line prosecutors threaten to quit.
Well, it's a pretty big deal, and they withdrew.
Because of a
Mr. Barr,
discussion over sentencing.
Americans
akin
from
to
both
this.
parties are concerned that in Donald Trump's America, there's two systems of justice. One for Mr. Trump and his cronies, and another for the rest of us. But that can only happen if you enable it. At your confirmation hearing, you were asked, do you believe a president could lawfully issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? You said, no.
Not to what?
That would be a crime. You were asked, could a president issue a pardon in exchange for the recipient's promise to not incriminate him? And you responded, no, that would be a crime. Is that right?
Yes, I said that.
You said a crime. You didn't say it'd be wrong. You didn't say it'd be unlawful. You said it would be a crime. And when you said that a president swapping a pardon to silence a witness would be a crime, you were promising the American people that if you saw that, you would do something about it. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, Mr. Barr, are you investigating Donald Trump for commuting the prison sentence of his longtime friend and political advisor, Roger Stone?
No.
Why not?
Why should I?
Well, let's talk about that. Mr. Stone was convicted by a jury on 7 counts of lying in the Russia investigation. He bragged that he lied to save Trump's butt. But why would he lie? Your prosecutors, Mr. Barr, told a jury that Stone lied because the truth looked bad for Donald Trump. And what truth is that? Well, Donald Trump denied in written answers to the Russia investigators that he talked to Roger Stone during the time Roger Stone was in contact with agents of a Russian influence operation. There's evidence that Trump and Stone indeed did talk during that time. You would agree that it's a federal crime to lie under oath. Is that right?
Yes.
It's a crime for you, it's a crime for me, and it's certainly a crime for the President of the United States. Is that right?
Yes.
So if Donald Trump lied to the Mueller investigators, which you agree would be a crime, then Roger Stone was in a position to expose Donald Trump's lies. Are you familiar with the December 3rd, 2018 tweet where Donald Trump said Roger Stone had shown guts by not testifying against him?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
You don't read the president's tweets?
No.
Well, there's a lot of evidence in the president's tweets, Mr. Attorney General. I think you should start reading them because he said Mr. Stone showed guts, but on July 10 of this year, Roger Stone declared to a reporter, I had 29 or 30 conversations with Trump during the campaign period. Trump knows I was under enormous pressure to turn on him. It would have eased my situation considerably, but I didn't. The prosecutors wanted me to play Judas. I refused. Are you familiar with that Stone statement?
Actually, I'm not.
So how can you sit here and tell us, why should I investigate the President of the United States, if you're not even aware of the facts concerning the President using the pardon or commutation power to swap the silence of a witness?
Because we require, a reliable predicate before we open a criminal investigation.
And I just gave to you, sir.
I don't consider it. I consider it a very Rube Goldberg theory that you have.
Well, it sounds like you're hearing this
And by the way, if I applied this standard, there'd be a
General,
lot more people under investigation.
Mr. Attorney General, the very same day that Roger Stone said that, Donald Trump,
That's one of the,
no surprise,
the true
computed
two
his
standards of justice were really
So-
during the tail end of the Obama administration.
Mr. Attorney General, let's turn to the Michael Cohen case. Are you aware, sir, that Michael Cohen, after being released from prison, was asked to not engage with the media, including to write a book? Were you aware that that was going to be asked of him?
Was I aware?
Yes.
No.
Do you know if anyone else in your department was aware?
Maybe I should tell you what happened.
Why don't you tell us what happened?
Okay. He was furloughed from the Bureau of Prisons.
No. Why don't you tell us why he was asked to
I will
sign
tell
an
you,
agreement not
because something that people don't seem to understand is that his home confinement was not being supervised by the Bureau of Prisons.
Now, the
It was being supervised by the probation office, which is part of the U.S. court system. And
Are
it was
you
the
aware-
U.S. court system that had the requirements about
And
not
yes,
writing.
that U.S. court system called your actions retaliatory. Do you agree with that?
No, so all I know is what has been said in court before the judge and in the record,
Mr.
which
Barr.
is that the individual was then called by the U.S. court system saying that this guy Cohen is uncooperative, he's not agreeing to the conditions. And at that point, a Bureau of Prisons person made the decision that he was no longer eligible for home confinement.
Conditions that a federal judge said no other inmate had ever been asked of in his experience. Mr. Barr, you told ABC News that the president's tweets sometimes make your job impossible. But sir, your job is only impossible if you enable the president's corrupt schemes. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barr, for being here today. I'd like to ask you some questions about the legal standard for seizing and arresting protesters. Under the Fourth Amendment, it requires probable cause before you can seize and arrest a protester, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and the probable cause has to be particularized to a particular person. So if a protester was merely standing around in a crowd in the vicinity of someone else suspected of criminal activity, you cannot arrest that peaceful protester. In other words, there's no such thing as probable cause by mere association, correct?
Well, not strictly, but I'll say that, you do need particularized probable cause.
Okay, and if there's no probable cause, then
If someone
you can't
jumps
arrest
into a
protester,
getaway car
correct?
and there are 3 or 4 people in there, that might be enough to give you probable cause, just those circumstances. You don't need it on each individual.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney General. If there is no probable cause, you can't arrest a protester, correct?
I said at the beginning, arrest has to be predicated on probable cause.
All right. Now, an arrest can also occur whether or not the federal official says it's an arrest. So, for example, if a federal officer takes a protester into custody, transport that protester, let's say, to a federal building, detains a person for questioning, that will constitute an arrest whether or not the federal official says the person is under arrest, correct?
Well, that would require a very intensive review of all the specifics involved.
Actually, it wouldn't. In the case of Dunaway versus New York, which is black letter law for over 40 years, the question was whether the police violated the 4th and 15th Amendments when, without probable cause to arrest, they took petitioners into custody, transported him to a police station, and detained him for questioning. So the answer is yes, that would constitute an arrest.
No, the answer is that, Fourth Amendment is ultimately governed by reasonableness, and there can be circumstances. The question sometimes is, when does something actually become custody?
Reclaiming my time, this is not a trick question, Mr. Barr. I'm just citing you what the Supreme Court said. So here's the problem. Under this standard black letter law, which has been in effect for over 40 years, what the federal forces in Portland did was unconstitutional. Federal forces in full combat gear, in the dark of night, grabbed a protester who was peacefully standing there, forced him into an unmarked van, drove him to a separate location, searched him, detained him, and questioned him. That is what police states do. That's what authoritarian regimes do.
But I don't think those were the facts.
That's not, I haven't asked you a question yet, Mr. Barr. Okay. What the federal officials did was illegal because they didn't have probable cause. And how do we know that? Because Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Service, Chris Klein, admitted it on national TV. Deputy Director Klein said that the individual that they were questioning was in a crowd and in an area where another individual was aiming a laser at the eyes of officers. That's guilt by association. That's what the Fourth Amendment prohibits. Deputy Director Klein further stated that the protester was released after federal officials concluded, quote, they did not have what they needed, unquote, which again shows there's no probable cause. And it appears that federal Deputy Director Klein appears to understand that there was no probable cause because he essentially justifies that action as saying it wasn't an arrest. He calls it, quote, a simple engagement, unquote. I'm a former prosecutor. I've never heard that term, a simple engagement, because it's a made-up excuse. What these federal officials did was an arrest. They grabbed a peaceful protester, they forced him into a van, drove him to another location, questioned him. That is exactly what the Supreme Court prohibited over 40 years ago.
So
and
I
that's not
obviously,
an isolated incident.
I obviously don't know
In the
that.
Washington Post, I haven't asked you a question yet. In a Washington Post article on July 24th entitled Operation Diligent Valor, federal agents told reporters that there's no basis for these arrests. They said, quote, at times they have grabbed an individual and taken them inside the courthouse for questioning before determining that they had no probable cause to charge them with any crime, unquote. Deputy Director Klein said that they coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office on all of these arrests. I urge you to instruct your federal officials to comply with the Constitution, and I ask you to investigate these arrests because many of them are in violation of the Fourth Amendment. We do not live in a police state. We're better than that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since Representative Liu didn't allow you any time to answer his allegations, would you care to answer any of his allegations?
Yes, I mean, obviously, I don't know all the particulars of any individual case out there, but based on my general understanding, what had happened was that when they tried to effectuate arrests of the ringleaders or the people who were engaged in violence or that they saw with lasers and so forth, and they went out, they were immediately swarmed by people in black, and there was a lot of violence, so they couldn't effectuate the arrest. So the modus operandi was changed, and based on specific information as to individuals who were seen doing things and identified, they later tried to pick them up when there was less of a risk of this kind of mob response. The fact that if you have information that someone has a laser and is using it and later pick them up and he doesn't have it, it doesn't mean that there wasn't probable cause. It means he doesn't have the laser. The question is, was it reasonable for you to rely on the information that you had and the identification of that individual? In some cases, it could be a misidentification. In other cases, it could be the person, ditched the laser. So there is a distinction between whether the person ultimately can be shown to have violated the law and whether there was probable cause for the police to make the inquiry and take them and interrogate them or ask them questions at least.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I think I have to tell you, you probably know this, my constituents are scared. Americans are scared. I mean, they watch the TV, they see all this rioting, looting going on, statues being torn down. In Arizona, where I'm from, more guns are being sold than ever. I think there's more new gun owners than ever. And this has to stop. And I think that it's really important, as the saying goes, that in order to solve a problem, the first step is to realize there's a problem. And so I find it very disturbing, should I say, that Chairman Nadler denies that Antifa even exists. He said it to a reporter He said on the floor of the United States House of Representatives that it was a fantasy, a made-up fantasy. And then in this very room, just recently, Congresswoman Jayapal, who represents the Seattle area, said, when I was talking about the autonomous zone and the takeover, she said, the area is just a few miles from where I sit right now, and there is no takeover. There is no takeover. She also said, lies are being spread by my colleagues in this committee. This area is perfectly peaceful. She also said, my Republican colleagues keep saying the Seattle Police Precinct was taken over by protesters. This is incorrect. Incorrect. No one has taken over that building. Mr. Attorney General, is that your understanding of what happened there? Do you agree with Ms. Jayapal that there was no takeover? It was just
Jayapal.
peaceful?
If you're going to say my name, please
Jayapal?
say it right. It's Jayapal.
Jayapal, would you agree with that? And also, in answer, why do you think these autonomous zones in Democrat-led cities are dangerous to America?
Well, starting with they're dangerous because they are purporting to keep on the outside duly constituted authority of the government. They're also, to me, outrageous because the people who are living now under this autonomous zone haven't selected the government. They've selected the duly authorized government of the city and the state. So it's quite an outrage that people would use force to take over an area. What makes me concerned for the country is this is the first time in my memory that the leaders of one of our great two political parties, the Democratic Party, are not coming out and condemning mob violence and the attack on federal courts. Why can't we just say, the violence against federal courts has to stop? Could we hear something like that?
Mr. Attorney General, I totally agree. I support what you're doing, and I support what President Trump is doing for law and order in our country, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The committee will stand in recess for 5 minutes. The committee will resume. Mr. Cicilline.
Sir, in your opening statement, you continue with your sustained effort to undermine the finding of Russian interference in our election. In March 2019, you sent a letter to the committee mischaracterizing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's finding that Vladimir Putin interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion to benefit Donald Trump. Mr. Mueller promptly sent you a letter calling you out for your mischaracterization, and you never corrected it. You then delayed the release of the full report, leaving the American people stewing with your misleading summary in support of President Trump's bogus claims that there was no collusion, no obstruction. You repeat these claims today, that there was no basis for this investigation and it was politically motivated by calling it the Russiagate scandal. But of course, in December 2019, the Justice Department's own Inspector General, your department's, Michael Horowitz, found that the investigation had been initiated properly and without political bias. Isn't that correct?
No.
It's not correct? That was not Mr. Horowitz's finding?
No. He said...
You are wrong, Mr. Attorney General. He found the investigation had been initiated properly.
He said he found no
reclaiming my time without political bias.
He said he
found
no evidence.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney, in April of this year, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee unanimously found that Russia interfered with our elections and attempted to undermine American democracy, correct?
And I said so too.
Is it ever appropriate, sir, for the president to solicit or accept foreign assistance in an election?
It depends what kind of assistance.
Is it ever appropriate for the president or presidential candidate to accept or solicit foreign assistance of any kind in his or her election?
No, it's not appropriate.
Okay, I'm glad. Sorry you had to struggle with that one, Mr. Attorney General. Now let's turn to the First Amendment. Americans all across this country have been exercising their First Amendment rights to peacefully protest police brutality against black people. I've read your statement, I listened to you this morning, and we're certainly aware of certain individuals who have engaged in violent acts. And we all agree that's wrong. But there was a lot missing from your statement. For example, as I'm sure you've also seen, the vast majority of protesters are peaceful. And despite that, unidentified federal agents have attempted to prevent these mothers, veterans, and peaceful Americans from exercising their First Amendment rights, even using unmarked vehicles to grab protesters off the street and using tear gas and munitions against them. You forcefully condemned protesters this morning, but let me ask you, sir, why have you not condemned the federal officers you're sending into cities without proper training who are attempting to take away the constitutional rights of Americans peacefully protesting?
I haven't condemned protesters. Protesters are good. Demonstrations are good. They're part of the First Amendment.
So let me ask
what
Mr.
I'm condemning is people who commit crime.
Yeah, we agree. Do you think it's ever appropriate, Mr. Barr, for officers to use force against peaceful protesters? Yes or no?
Not against peaceful protesters.
So you also don't mention in your statement today or your testimony that federal officers have even tear-gassed elected representatives. County Commissioner Sharon Myron confirmed firsthand, last night I was tear-gassed by a federal occupying force. I saw throw canisters of poison without warning into a nonviolent crowd, including elders and the vulnerable. And on July 23rd, the mayor, Ted Wheeler, was tear-gassed. He called the tactics of the officers abhorrent. These are elected representatives with grave concerns that officers are using abhorrent tactics, including tear-gassing elderly, nonviolent Americans. So let me ask you, sir, do you think it's ever appropriate to use tear gas on peaceful protesters, yes or no?
Well, the problem in these things sometimes occur because it's hard to separate people who
Mr. Barr, my question is very specific. Do you think it is ever appropriate to use tear gas on peaceful protesters, yes or no?
It is appropriate to use tear gas when it's indicated to disperse.
On peaceful protesters?
To disperse an unlawful assembly, and sometimes, unfortunately, peaceful protesters are affected by it.
Okay, now I'm going to show you there's video evidence as well. I'm going to ask you to look at this video. Just so you know,
this is the video that's capturing the nation's attention this weekend, shot by Tribune reporter.
that video is of Christopher David, a Navy veteran, being beaten and tear gassed by the officers. Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, I didn't see him tear gas. Seems to be gas in the area. I don't know what kind of gas it was, and I don't know whether it was directed at him.
Do you think what happened to Mr. David was appropriate, Mr. Barr?
The Inspector General's reviewing that particular
Well,
incident.
do you think he deserved to get pepper sprayed and beaten to the point of broken bones?
As I say, the Inspector General is going to review the incident.
So as the top law enforcement official in our country, do you think Americans who show up to peacefully protest should expect to be beaten and pepper sprayed and have their bones broken by federal officers?
Well, I don't think that what was happening immediately around the courthouse was a peaceful protest.
That's not my question, Mr. Barr.
Well, that's where that...
My question is, do you think as the
that-
chief,
that's where the
reclaiming my
video is
time,
from. That's where the
reclaiming my
video
time,
is from.
Mr. Barr, my question is, do you think as the top law enforcement official in this country that Americans who show up to peacefully protest should expect to be beaten, pepper sprayed, and have their bones broken by federal officials? Yes or no?
I don't think peaceful protesters should face that.
And that's correct. And isn't protecting the First Amendment freedom of Americans at least as important as protecting a building from vandalism?
I think
we've fought for, I've not posed a question. We've fought for a democracy, for the right to speak freely, and you are attempting to take that away. And what's worse, you're doing it for the sole purpose of furthering the president's political agenda and generating footage for Trump campaign commercials. The Justice Department is responsible for protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, not to serve as the president's personal bully or political director. And speaking of protesters, it's worth remembering every suffragette, every person who marched to end child labor, every abolitionist who demanded an end to slavery was a protester. The revolutionaries who transformed us from colonists into a nation were protesters. Protesters aren't chaos. They're deeply American examples of values, a desire for this country to be at its best self. They're righteous, sometimes they're necessary. One of America's most beloved and effective protesters, John Lewis, lies in state 1,000 feet from here in a deserved place of honor. And sir, your failure to respect the role of peaceful protest in this country is a disgrace, it's un-American, and it's important to remember what these protests are about. Black Lives Matter, abuse at the hands of police by black Americans, and I want to let you see now a video that fairly represents peaceful protest that is happening all across America that you conveniently omitted from your testimony and your statement. There was a 9-minute video shown by the other side, so I expect
Not all
the same
9,
courtesy.
only part of it.
With that, back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields
Mr. Chairman, just real quick. I don't think we've ever had a hearing where the witness wasn't allowed to respond to points made, questions asked, and attacks made. Not just in this hearing, not just in this committee, but every committee I've been on. So particularly when you think about the fact we got the Attorney General of the United States here.
Gentleman does not have time.
I don't want the time. I want the Attorney General to be able to have enough time to respond to accusations and questions asked him, and you guys not cut him off.
What you want is irrelevant. What irrelevant are the rules? Gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you. Sir, did I hear you correctly to say that the purpose of unleashing this federal agent assault with tear gas and rubber bullets and pepper spray on 2,000 nonviolent protesters in Lafayette Square was to secure and defend the St. John's Episcopal Church? Was that the purpose of it?
No, I didn't say that. I made very clear that the purpose was to move the perimeter to I Street, which had been the plan, as far as I'm aware, all day the week before.
So it was legitimate in that case?
I'm talking about the June 1st.
Yeah, the June 1st assault on a lot of people, including my constituents, and
Well,
I had to bring them to your office to talk about it.
Well, I don't think it was an assault. They were told by loudspeaker that the Park Police were preparing to clear H Street, and could they move off H Street?
Reclaiming my time, I think you said something to the effect of the St. John's Episcopal Church would have been overrun.
No, that was on Sunday night, I believe. And
Okay.
hope I
Are
have
you
this right.
aware that the rector of the church, that the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington, and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church nationally, along with the Catholic bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, all denounced this police assault on the civil rights and civil liberties of the people?
Did they do that before or after the fire was put out?
Well, all that I know is that they denounced what you did. And if you read what the Archbishop, the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington wrote, said that using police force to clear nonviolent protesters without notice in order to conduct this grotesque photo opportunity was antithetical to the principles of Christianity. But what I want to ask you about was COVID-19, because we now lead the world in COVID-19 case count and death count. President Trump, of course, promised the disease would magically disappear. He advertised quack medical cures like injecting people with disinfectant. He told his people to slow down all the testing and refused for months to wear a mask. Last night, he retweeted a number of messages claiming that Dr. Fauci misled the American people by dismissing hydroxychloroquine as a cure for the disease. So now we have 150,000 dead Americans, 4 million infected, 40 million jobless. We lose more than 1,000 people every day, 1 American every 90 seconds. But you called his public health leadership superb, and you threw the weight of the Justice Department behind his campaign to shut down state public health orders in March and April. Now, if you look at the screen, you will see 2 tweets from the President of the United States: liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia. On April 17th, he retweeted the slogans of right-wing protesters that are blocking access to hospitals and trying to overthrow public health orders in those states. And you snapped to attention on April 27th. You designated a prosecutor to try to bring down those very public health orders in Michigan and Virginia. 2 days later, armed right-wing protesters and white supremacists disrupted the Michigan legislature, leveling death threats against Governor Whitmer, confronting police, taunting lawmakers, and forcing the legislature to shut down as they brandished their long guns and shouted in the faces of police officers. But you didn't send in a secret paramilitary police force on horseback to unleash tear gas, pepper spray, billy clubs, and rubber bullets against these protesters storming the state capitol in Michigan. No, you embraced their cause by joining litigation against the governors of Michigan and Virginia. Now, of course, your side lost your motions for emergency injunctions, but you got to spread Trump's message that it was time to call off the stay-at-home orders, the masking and social distancing. Here's what you said on national TV, echoing the claim in April that the cure was worse than the disease. Quote, "You can't just keep on feeding the patient chemotherapy and say, well, we're killing the cancer, because we were getting to the point where we're killing the patient." Do you remember saying that?
Yeah,
Well, what do you mean by that?
exactly what it says. You have to balance the cure with the danger, which we leave to governors. You know, I know everyone likes.
Well, no,
I know everyone likes to lay everything at the feet of the
against the
president,
governor.
but this is a federal republic, and the president respected that. And our response,
Okay, we're claiming
and
my
our
time.
response has been largely
excuse me.
run by governors. Now, for someone who claims to be so concerned about executive overreach, I haven't heard anyone talk about just keeping an eye on what the governor's doing.
Mr. Barr, with no vaccine...
And that's all the Department of Justice
Excuse me, the
is
time is
doing,
fine. With no
especially in
vaccine...
the area of religious liberty.
The Supreme Court rejected your position on religious liberty 5-4 and said there was nothing wrong with applying public health orders to churches.
That was on an injunction.
Do you accept that or you don't accept it? Well, no, we'll talk about it later. Mr. Barr, with no vaccine, no treatment, no cure in sight, you work to disarm the states of the only weapon we have against this disease, public health measures. And now we pay the price of this policy in overrun intensive care units and morgues, a shortage of coffins and refrigerated trucks, and an out-of-control pandemic, which makes us a global pariah state whose citizens cannot enter dozens of foreign countries, including Canada. Do you know what Dr. Fauci was saying at the same time that you were moving to take down those public health orders? Here's what Dr. Fauci was warning us about 3 months ago about the premature abandonment of health orders. If only you had listened. He said, "I feel if that occurs, there is a real risk you will trigger an outbreak and you may not be able to control it," which in fact paradoxically...
We were not taking down public health orders. We were making narrow...
The gentleman's time is
We were calling attention to the fact...
Will you restore my time because this witness is speaking over my
You
time?
went over
No, I
time, let the
cannot.
You were
witness
over your time.
respond.
He's trying to
Gentleman's
answer.
time is expired. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Barr, on June 1st, there were protests against the murder of George Floyd and police brutality in Lafayette Park. Let us not be distracted by you or my GOP colleagues as to what these powerful and massive protests were actually about. They were about the persistent killing of black bodies by law enforcement, and finally, an awakening in America of the conscience of our country. And yet, your response, Mr. Barr, was to direct federal officers to close in on the protesters and to use shields offensively as weapons, tear gas, pepper balls, irritants, explosive devices, batons, and horses to clear the area just so the president could get a photo op. So I do want to ask you, do you think that your response, do you think the response at Lafayette Square to tear gas, pepper spray, and beat protesters and injure American citizens who were just simply exercising their First Amendment rights was appropriate?
Well, first, it's my understanding that no tear gas was used on Monday, June 1st.
Mr. Barr, that is a semantic distinction that has been proven false by many fact checkers.
How is it semantic?
Do you think...
How is it semantic? Tear gas is a particular compound.
You talked about chemical irritants, and it has been proven false by reports. So just answer the question. Do you think that it was appropriate at Lafayette Park to pepper spray, tear gas, and beat protesters and injure American citizens?
Well, I don't accept your characterization of what happened, but as I explained, the effort there was
Mr. Barr, I just
effort
asked for
there
a
was
yes
to
or
move.
no, so let me just tell you, I'm starting to lose my temper. According to sworn testimony before the House Natural Resources Committee by Army National Guard officer Adam DeMarco, who was there, this was, quote, an unprovoked escalation and excessive use of force against peaceful protesters.
Well, I don't
Numerous
remember, I don't
media
remember
reports have
DeMarco as
confirmed
being,
this.
I don't
Mr.
remember
Barr,
DeMarco
excuse
as being
me, this
involved
is
in
my
any of the
time.
decision-making.
Sir, the president told governors on a telephone call that the way to deal with the protesters of police brutality and systemic racism like in Lafayette Square is that, quote, you have to get much tougher. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. These are terrorists. And he also talked about you on that call, sir. Here's what he said. He said, the Attorney General is here, Bill Barr, and we will activate Bill Barr and activate him strongly. Do you remember that call, Mr. Barr?
Yes, I do, but he wasn't talking about protesters, he was talking
Mr.
about
Barr,
rioters.
apparently the president believes that you can be activated to implement the president's agenda and dominate American people exercising First Amendment rights if they're protesting against him. But let's look at how you respond when the protesters are supporters of the president. On two separate occasions, after President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan Capitol carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No,
You're not aware of that?
I was not aware of it.
Major protests in Michigan, you're the Attorney General, and you didn't know that the protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded. So obviously you couldn't be concerned about that.
Well, there are a lot
You-
of protests
didn't-
around the United States, and on June
Attorney
1st,
General
I
Barr,
was
you
worried
seem
about
to
the
be
District of
engaging
Columbia,
in
which is
protests
federal.
in certain parts of the country. You're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas and
I am
Confederate
aware of
flags, excuse me,
protesters
Mr.
in the
Barr, this
federal
is
government.
my time and I control it. You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor of Michigan to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in to do to the president's supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president. You take an aggressive approach to Black Lives Matter protests, but not to right-wing extremists threatening to lynch a governor if it's for the president's benefit. Did I get it right, Mr. Barr?
I have responsibility for the federal government, and the White House is the seat of the executive
Mr. Barr, let me just
branch,
make it clear.
not
You
for
are
the-
supposed
the
to
Michigan
represent
authorities
the
can
people
handle-
of the United
Michigan
States
authorities
of
can
America,
handle-
not violate people's First Amendment rights. You are supposed to uphold democracy and secure equal justice under the law, not violently dismantle certain protesters based on the president's personal agenda.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to also introduce into the record a report from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which says that over the past 20 years, more than 250 million ballots have been cast by mail, and the fraud rate is 0.00006%.
Without objection,
Thank you, and I yield my time.
the gentleman yields back. Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, during your, over here,
I'm sorry.
over here in the corner. Earlier during your testimony, you talked about gun violence, and you asked the question, what about those lives? And yes, Mr. Barr, those lives do matter. But do you believe that police officers should be held or held to a higher standard?
Yes, and someone mentioned my comment about we shouldn't permit resistance. We shouldn't take that as a matter of course. But I never suggest that just because someone resists, that justifies whatever's done.
Thank you so much for that, because good police officers also believe that they're held to a higher standard. So I'm glad to hear you say that. As a former police detective, I've solved many cases based on patterns of behavior, and there is an alarming pattern, I believe, that's developing. It appears, Mr. Barr, every time a U.S. attorney investigates the president or those close to him, he or she is removed and replaced by one of your friends. You have removed U.S. attorneys in the Eastern District of New York, the District of Columbia, and the Eastern District of Texas. On June 19th, you announced Mr. Berman would be stepping down. Now, let me just be clear. When you told America that Mr. Berman was stepping down, did Mr. Berman tell you he was stepping down?
No.
Okay.
But stepping down is the language that I'm told.
He did not tell you that.
No.
Okay,
But it's the language we usually use to leave flexibility as to whether the person is doing it on their own.
On June 20th, when asked about the basis for Mr. Berman's removal, on the very day you announced he was being fired, stepping down, the president's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, suggested that, and I quote, "The reason may lie in the fact that Berman's office got involved in what Giuliani described as baseless investigations." Sir, if that wasn't true, if you didn't remove Mr. Berman because he was overseeing investigations of the president and those close to him, why would the president's personal attorney think that?
I'm sorry, what did he say and when? I didn't hear the quote.
Mr. Giuliani suggests that
When?
June 20th, that he may have been fired because he was investigating baseless investigations.
Well, if he said that, that's nonsense. Number one, anyone familiar with the Department of Justice would say that removing a component head is not going to have any effect on any pending investigation.
Okay, and I know you're aware of reports that Berman's office was in fact investigating the president's former personal attorney, Mr. Cohen, his current personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, his current personal attorney's associates, and his presidential inauguration.
Well,
Mr. Barr.
I don't mean to suggest just by my silence that I'm confirming that. That seems to be your opinion.
Okay, all right. Have you in any way attempted to influence or interfere with any investigation in the Southern District, including the investigations I just mentioned?
I have not interfered in any investigation. I've raised questions on occasion about certain matters, but as far as I'm aware, the office was satisfied with the resolution.
Mr. Berman testified your efforts to remove him bypassed the normal operation of law. Now we know the OLC opinion indicates that a sitting president cannot be indicted or criminally prosecuted, because you made sure President Trump understood that in your 19-page or however long job application. However, you are aware the special counsel confirmed that a sitting president can be investigated. You did read that in the special counsel's report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Given Mr. Trump's residence and former business location, the Southern District, Berman's office would have decision-making authority over whether to investigate the president himself, and you removed him.
I've explained why I removed him.
Okay, sitting here today under penalty of perjury, do you still maintain, as you stated in a February 13th interview, that the president has never asked you to do anything in a criminal case? Yes or no, please?
Yeah, no. I mean, will I confirm it? Is that the question?
Or do you stand by your testimony or your...
He has never asked me, directed me, pressured me to do anything in a criminal case.
Okay, all right. You are aware, and I think you had this conversation earlier with one of my colleagues, that the president's former attorney, Mr. Cohen, was released early from prison due to concerns of COVID-19.
Yes.
Okay, and why did you support the decision to send Mr. Cohen back to prison?
I didn't even know the decision to send him back.
Did you support it based after you
Well, I haven't looked into it enough, but
Gentlewoman's
my
time
understanding of
has
why it
expired.
happened was,
Mr. Barr, as a former
The gentlewoman's
police
time has expired.
The president has made a mockery of the Department of Justice, and I believe as the nation's top cop, no one should care more about that than you.
the Bureau of Prisons.
Mr. Armstrong
Chairwoman,
is
I yield back. Thank you.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Correa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Barr, welcome. Let's talk a little bit about the census if we can. As you know, that's the process where every 10 years we decide how many congressional seats each state gets, how much funding for schools, healthcare, other issues each region gets. Let's talk about the President's memo directing the Commerce Secretary to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment count of the 2020 census count. Mr. Barr, President is essentially saying something, trying to do something that's unconstitutional and illegal. 14th Amendment, and I quote, representatives shall be apportioned among several states according to their respective numbers, counting whole numbers of persons in each state. And then federal law, as you know, 2 U.S.C. subsection 2A, and I quote, the President shall transmit to the Congress a statement showing the whole number of persons in each state. Did I read those correctly, sir, more or less?
Yes.
Do you agree that the President's memo essentially violates the Constitution?
No.
Are undocumented people not whole individuals?
Or not what?
Are undocumented individuals in this country not whole people?
They are obviously people, but the legal issue there was the terminology of the Constitution.
Well, if I may.
It reflects the decision at the time of the Constitution that they count inhabitants.
I may reclaim my time, sir. You used to work for the Department of Justice back in 1989. There was a letter written to Senator Jeff Bingham by the DOJ on point. If there's a slide, there's a letter, and I would ask unanimous consent to admit that to the record.
Without objection.
And I quote, in the past, the Department of Justice has taken the position that Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, that the original apportionment and census clause of Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, requires that inhabitants of states who are illegal aliens be included in the census count. And in our view, this issue today, we have found no basis for reversing that position. Are you reversing that position now?
Well, I think what the department advised is that this came up because Alabama claims you cannot count illegal aliens in the census under the Constitution. The department looked at it and advised that Congress can determine the meaning of inhabitant for this purpose, that it is not a self-defining term as they
I've only got 2 minutes, sir.
that they recognized.
Mr. Barr, if I may.
Yeah, but this is a hearing. I thought I was the one that was supposed to be heard.
Well, and I'm going to get there. The current dispute, you talked back when the Supreme Court struck down the president's attempt to put a citizenship question on the census. At that time, the president announced an executive order to collect citizenship information by other means. And at that time, you made reference to a current dispute over whether illegal aliens can be included in the apportionment purposes. Is that what you're referring to now, sir?
I think that I could have been referring to the Alabama case.
So
I can't remember.
Is the DOJ studying this issue? Have you concluded?
Yes.
Can you provide this committee with discussions, any research, any concluding memos on that issue?
I'll look into it. But we have considered it, and as I said, our advice has been that Congress does have the power to define the term inhabitant to either include or exclude illegal aliens.
But we're talking about the president's executive orders.
Well,
sir.
Congress has delegated that power to the Commerce Secretary. So as the law stands now, we think the Commerce Secretary, as the delegate of congressional power, can define that term. That's a reasonable argument to make.
Mr. Attorney General, in the last few seconds I have, President has to be within the law. Nobody is above the law in this country, including the President of the United States. My concern is he goes around doing tweets, memos, dictums that are clearly unconstitutional. My district, sir, is a working class, hard-working community. Immigrants, the greatest generation. All we want is equity based on the census. We want to make sure we get our federal dollars like everybody else around the country. We want to make sure that our representation is equal, individual, in Orange County as it is in other parts of the country. All we ask for is respect, sir. I ask you, please tell the president, stop tweeting things, stop writing memos that are clearly unconstitutional. Thank you very much, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Attorney General Barr, I wanted to follow up on some questions from one of my colleagues. You testified earlier that you have at times voted by mail. Is that correct?
I remember, I think, once voting by mail.
So if public records show you voted by mail in 2012 and 2019, you'd agree with that?
I think, I can't really remember the details.
Okay.
I think on one occasion I had to go to a station and
Okay,
vote
but you did at
before the
least
election.
once
And
vote
I
by
think in
mail.
another one I voted by mail.
I'm reclaiming my time, sir.
Yeah.
I raise this because in May of this year, 800 public health experts from across the nation sent a letter urging Congress to, quote, prepare for a presidential election by mail to allow Americans to vote from home and assure their health and safety. You're aware that health experts have emphasized that voting by mail is critical to protect public health in this upcoming election, correct?
When was that?
In May of this year. If you're not aware of it, I can provide
Okay.
this to
I'd be
you,
interested in
your
seeing.
staff.
Yeah.
Great, I have an extra copy for you. So that public health advice is really important to citizens in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because we have a large population of seniors who are at higher risk for the coronavirus. They shouldn't have to choose between risking their lives and exercising their right to vote. But the problem we're facing is that the president has repeatedly sought to cast doubt on the security of mail-in ballots, saying that the 2020 election could be rigged with, quote, millions of mail-in ballots printed by foreign countries, end quote. And you, sir, have repeated this disinformation.
Well, it's not
Barr,
disinformation.
I don't have a question for you yet. Here it comes, though. Last month, you echoed the president's conspiracy theory when you suggested in at least 3 interviews that, quote, foreign countries could manufacture counterfeit ballots, end quote, to influence the presidential election, correct? You did that in at least 3 interviews?
Yes.
Okay. But in fact, you have no evidence that foreign countries can successfully sway our elections with counterfeit ballots, do you?
No, I don't, but I have common
Okay.
sense.
Okay, well, and that's what you responded when you were directly challenged on that. You said, no, you didn't have evidence, but it was obvious. According to state election officials, your alleged concerns here are not obvious, but in fact are outrageous. Every state in the union has absentee ballots. 2/3 of the states allow for vote by mail for any reason. 5 states, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Utah, vote entirely by mail and have done so for decades. Even the U.S. military uses mail-in ballots, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So isn't it true that after you suggested without evidence that foreign adversaries could sway our elections using counterfeit ballots, election experts and officials from around the country said that what you suggested was virtually impossible, preposterous, would never happen, and would be readily detected due to the multiple levels of security used with mail-in ballot systems?
There are not multiple levels of security.
Okay,
used
well,
with
so
mail. And I don't agree. I
recall-
don't agree that it's a
Okay, reclaiming my time. And again, I'm happy to supply you with the statements that were
Before
provided
Donald
from around the
Trump
country.
raised concerns about
In
it, every
fact,
major publication.
Reclaiming my time, sir. In fact, there is no evidence that foreign countries can make counterfeit ballots and create a real threat to our election security. Are you aware that in May, the president tweeted, and I quote, mail-in voting will lead to massive fraud and abuse. It will also lead to the end of our great Republican Party, end quote.
I wasn't aware of that tweet.
Well, that tweet suggests, sir, that the president is spreading disinformation about mail-in ballots because he's afraid that if more people vote, he and his party will lose. The fact, Mr. Barr, is that our foreign adversaries cannot actually influence our elections by submitting massive counterfeit ballots, but the FBI and our intelligence services have repeatedly warned that those adversaries are actively trying to sow mistrust of our election systems, and by repeating disinformation about mail-in voting, you and the president are helping them. Just switching gears, you would agree.
Well, I'd like an
you
opportunity
would
to
agree
respond to
that
that.
prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party, wouldn't you?
Who makes contributions?
You said in 2017 that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And in fact, you and your wife have donated over $730,000 to Republican and conservative candidates, including donations of $58,000 to Republican senators and Senate candidates in the 4 months preceding your confirmation. That's correct,
Are you
isn't it?
surprised I'm a Republican?
Is that correct, that you made those donations?
Over a long period of time.
Including just before?
That's a cumulative of a long period of time, but basically,
Mr.
I never
Chairman,
hid the
I
fact
yield
I'm a
back,
Republican.
and
I was
would
talking about
also-
career prosecutors
There's no question
generally,
before you.
have generally historically avoided making contributions, was my view.
$730,000 is not.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms.
Mr.
Garcia?
Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to introduce the 800, the public health expert letter signed by 800 individuals, the Attorney General's repeated interviews in which he suggested that our elections could be undermined, the overwhelming reaction from election officials around the country, and the articles concerning his campaign donations. Thank you.
Without objection, the articles will be entered into the record. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, your department released Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign manager, early from prison in May out of concern for the coronavirus. In March 26 and April 3rd, your department released guidelines, criteria by which, setting priorities by which people would be released early. By your own department's admission, Manafort did not meet that criteria. Since the start of this pandemic, we have repeatedly urged you to use your authority to protect vulnerable populations in prisons, and instead you released the president's former campaign manager. Sir, do you know how many federal inmates have tested positive for COVID-19 as of today?
Yeah, I have that number.
Quickly, sir, because the clock ticks.
Well,
we have a slide, if they'll bring it up, that shows us that 10,000 inmates have tested positive and over 1,000 staff have tested positive. Do you know how many have died?
about 100, almost 100, I think.
That's right. It's about 99 inmates have died, and yet only 5% have been released under your guidelines.
7,000.
You stated in May that you were taking, quote, every measure we can to protect federal inmates. The numbers, however, tell a different story, as do your actions. Despite releasing Manafort, your lawyers continue to argue against the release of prisoners. In April, vulnerable prisoners who suffer from serious at-risk health conditions like chronic asthma, heart disease, and kidney disease filed a lawsuit for early release in Ohio. These prisoners were being, quote, overcrowded in like cattle because prisoners were not able to social distance them. 550 prisoners sought release, yet your own department processed only 7 applications and denied them all. Yet you had time to process Manafort's application.
I didn't
but
process
apparently-
Manafort's
Well, your
application.
department did, sir. But apparently not these vulnerable Americans living at grave risk. In fact, in a series of rulings in April and May, an Ohio District Court ordered that your department, quote, act with urgency and to, quote, move inmates out due to continued risk of harm to prisoners and to government staff. And, sir, your department challenged that court order, did it not?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, you all did. You did not help move these inmates out as ordered. In fact, you tried to block the district court's order. However, the Supreme Court on May 26 rejected your department's request. Sir, 9 prisoners had died, and it's been 2 months since the Supreme Court's order. Do you even know today how many of those prisoners have been released or how many more have died?
No, I don't. You know, we had 100,
Well, sir-
we started out this with 170,000 prisoners, so we've lost.
I just need you to try to explain to me and to America, how is it that the former campaign manager of the President of the United States who did not meet the priority criteria, got released, even though your own department admitted he didn't meet the guidelines, but all these other folks were not? If it was deadly enough of a virus that you needed to protect the former campaign manager, why not all of these Americans who also have vulnerable and have at-risk conditions? Mr. Barr, the contrast says it all. And it is not just in Ohio. In fact, in my own home state in Texas, a federal prison housing women with mental and medical health issues just confirmed last week that of the 1,357 prisoners, over 500 tested positive for COVID. One prisoner recounted, "We're like a whole bunch of hamsters in a cage, chasing our own tails, and yet none have been released." Mr. Barr, have you seen those statistics, yes or no? Well, if you can't
I put out guidelines, general guidelines, to propel the release of.
Not released anyone.
I put out general guidelines.
One of those prisoners is a mother, Andrea Circle-Bear, who had to give birth on a ventilator in that facility because your department prioritizes releasing Paul Manafort instead of vulnerable Americans. A few weeks after this photo, Ms. Bear died, along with 2 other women housed in this facility from COVID-19. Sir, you could be saving lives by reducing the prison population. Yet you have blatantly abandoned your duty to these women. You have shamelessly abandoned your oath of office to protect all Americans impartially because you have prioritized giving special favors to the president's friends. This is not equal justice under the law. It's not the law that you and I both learned in law school. It is 2 simple systems of justice, one for the president's friends and one for everyone else.
The director of the BOP.
It is flat wrong.
Yeah,
Thank you, and I yield back.
Yeah, the director of the BOP testified under oath that no one from Justice Department was involved.
Gentlelady yields back.
Yeah, but the gentleman
Neguse.
has not been given an opportunity to respond, and that's
Ms.
been a
Neguse.
consistent problem.
Mr. Neguse is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. I want to go through a couple of your prior statements. On April 18th of 2019, you stated, quote, that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You're aware of that?
Mm-hmm.
Today, yes or no, Mr. Barr, under the penalty of perjury, do you testify that that statement was true at the time you made it?
I thought it to be true at the time I made it.
On
Why isn't it true?
June 9th, I'll get to that, Mr.
I
Barr.
mean, does it have to
Mr. Barr,
do with
I will
quibbling
get to
over-
that. Reclaiming my time, you answered the question.
Okay.
I have another question for you. On June 19th of
No,
2020.
actually, I need to answer that question.
Mr. Attorney General, you did answer the question.
No, you
I'll
said
give
under
an opportunity.
penalty of perjury. I'm going to answer the damn question, okay?
You said the answer
And-
was
and-
yes, is what you said.
Well,
Are you saying no?
I think what I was referring to, and I'd have to see the context of it, was the supplying of documents.
No, Mr. Attorney General, this statement was not limited to the supply of documents. You
I
stated
think
at a
that's
press,
what-
Mr. Attorney
I
General,
think
reclaiming
that's
my
what I was
time.
talking about.
Reclaiming my time.
I
You
think that's
stated
what I
at a
was
press
talking
conference
about.
On April 19th of 2019 that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You knew when you made that statement that the president had not agreed to be interviewed by the special counsel. Now, on June 18th
I think
of
I
this year,
subsequently
Mr.
said
Attorney
that
General,
I was referring to
on
the
June 18th,
production of documents.
Mr. Attorney General, on June 18th of this year, the Department of Justice issued a statement saying that Mr. Berman, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, had, quote, stepped down. You're aware of that statement being released by the department, correct?
Yes.
And do you testify today that that statement was true at the time the department issued it?
He may not have known it, but he was stepping down.
He may not have known that he was stepping down. That's your testimony today?
He was being removed.
Mr. Attorney General, the statement did not say that he was being removed. It did not say that he was being fired. It said that he was stepping down. And apparently your testimony today is that that was in fact accurate when Mr. Berman has testified under oath to this committee that it in fact was not. Now I want to talk about
No, he was
process.
removed.
Mr.
He was
Attorney General,
removed, and I wanted an opportunity to offer him another job and
I
talk
understand
to
your
him the
rationalization
next
for your
day.
answer, but the American
It's not a
people will let your
rationalization.
answer speak for itself. Now, Mr. Attorney General, earlier this year, President Trump stated that he had planned to make what he described as Vice President's, quote, Ukraine dealings an issue on the campaign trail. Earlier this year, on February 10th, you stated that you had set up a, quote, intake process for submission of information, intake process, end quote, for submission of information relating to the Ukraine to the Justice Department, and that included, quote, these are your words, anything Mr. Giuliani might provide. Do you recall making those comments?
Something along those lines.
You'd concede there isn't anything standard about the Attorney General creating a special process for information related to advancing.
I disagree.
You disagree.
And I also made it clear that that is a vetting process that's available to anybody.
Is that right? Which U.S. attorney have you assigned to receive information from Vice President Biden's personal lawyers regarding President Trump?
Well, maybe if they had vetted the dossier,
there's no.
maybe if they vetted the dossier, we wouldn't have the whole
Mr. Attorney General, there's
problem.
no U.S. attorney, of course, that you've appointed to do that because
What are
what
you
you have
talking about?
done with respect to this process is unprecedented. Now,
It
my
was
understanding-
cautionary so that we do not pollute the
General.
criminal investigative process with Ukrainian disinformation.
I will give you an opportunity to explain this intake process. My understanding is that you have directed.
You are gonna give me an opportunity?
I intend to right
Okay.
now. The Eastern District of New York, the U.S. attorney responsible for that district, my understanding is that you have asked that U.S. attorney to be responsible for the intake process. Is that right?
No.
That's wrong? The U.S. attorney?
The U.S. attorney in the Eastern District was given oversight of all Ukrainian-related cases, any new cases involving Ukraine.
Correct.
We face a problem with Ukraine, which is unreliable information coming in.
I appreciate
There's a lot
you
of
noting that.
corruption there. It's
I
a hall of
appreciate you-
mirrors.
Mr. Attorney General,
And I wanted to
appreciate
make
you noting
sure that before we got into criminal proceedings, and this was to everyone's benefit, particularly Vice President
Mr. Attorney
Biden,
General,
that the information was scrubbed
I
in
appreciate you
conjunction
noting
with
that,
the
and that is
intelligence
consistent
community.
with the memo that you issued, which said, any and all new matters relating to Ukraine shall be directed exclusively to the Eastern District of New York for investigation and appropriate handling, just as you've described right now. Now, of course, the U.S. attorney responsible in the Eastern District of New York was recently changed. My understanding is a few weeks ago, you announced that Seth Ducharme would be taking over to replace Rich Donahue. Mr. Ducharme, prior to serving
Pittsburgh is in
this
charge
role-
of the vetting.
Mr. Attorney General, prior to taking this position, Mr. Ducharme worked at Maine Department of Justice. Is that correct?
Yes, he was a counselor to me.
He was a counselor
And then
to
he
you.
was the principal assistant deputy attorney general.
That's right. And rather than having the acting U.S. attorney, the deputy U.S. attorney, rather, in that district
They wanted
serve,
to swap jobs.
you now have appointed your prior counsel to oversee that very same process. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath.
Mr. Chairman, before we go to Ms. McBath, could I enter a couple of documents ask for unanimous consent to enter 4 documents? The 2 memos I referred to, setting the guidelines for who gets released, a Washington Post article about Paul Manafort's release, and a testimony from the Council of Prison Locals 333 for the record.
Without objection, Ms. McBath is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you, Attorney General Barr, for joining us today and for the work that the committed public servants in your department are doing to keep our country safe. But, sir, just a few months ago in May, you said that you would be taking the President's position in urging the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act. When asked if you will still take that position, even if it means, and I quote, stripping millions of Americans of their health care in the middle of a pandemic, you stated that the case would not be argued until October, and that the President expects to fix and replace Obamacare with a better system. Attorney General Barr, let's be very, very clear. As public health officials and data have shown us, this pandemic is simply not going away. Just last week, it was reported that one hospital was planning to send coronavirus patients home to die. due to limited resources to treat them. So we're still facing an extremely critical and extremely serious situation. And even if you expect the president to figure out a new plan by October, the president has not yet put in place another system, nor is there any guarantee that he will do so by October, as you, quote, expect. So when you say you expect the president to figure out a new plan, you are taking a risk with millions of Americans' lives. You are risking the lives of millions, people who will not be covered for pre-existing conditions if the Supreme Court agrees with your position. Civil servants in your own department have disagreed with you on this matter. In fact, I'm introducing a statement by one of the lead attorneys on the ACA case, Joel McElvain, who resigned in protest when your department refused to defend the law as it is required. In my district, the 6th District of Georgia, Congressional District, there are over 300,000 people that have pre-existing conditions, and I, sir, am one of them, a 2-time breast cancer survivor. Our state is continuing to battle hard against a resurgence in COVID-19 cases. So I'm asking you, sir, not to gamble with American lives, not to gamble with my life. And I'd like you to confirm that if the president has no other plan in place by October, you will reverse course and drop your position that, I quote you directly, the entire ACA must fall.
I have 2 children who are cancer survivors, so I feel very strongly about this issue as a matter of policy, and I believe that the president's made clear that he will ensure that
Sir,
there will...
please answer my question. Will you stop playing politics with
Well,
Americans' health care in the middle of a pandemic?
I'm not playing politics. I'm the lawyer. I'm not in charge of health care policy.
Will you reverse your course and make sure that millions of Americans like me that depend on health care and treatment to stay alive, will you reverse your course to make sure that we have the ability to be able to live in this country freely with quality health care?
People will have the health care protection, and that will be accomplished either if I lose,
Okay,
if the
sir,
government, if the government loses the
no.
case,
I
if the
take this
Supreme
as a
Court
no.
strikes it down, then I think...
take this as a no. Sir, I
that
want to
based on
briefly go
history,
on.
there will be...
Sir, I'd like to go on. I'd like to briefly mention my concerns relating to gun violence, because that's actually how I got
relating
to
to what?
Washington.
What?
I want to briefly go on to another concern that I have relating to gun violence. That is
Okay.
actually how I got here.
Okay.
During the coronavirus outbreak, the nation has seen a dramatic increase in firearm sales and skyrocketing numbers of sales blocked by failed background checks. In March alone, the NICS background check system blocked 23,000 attempted sales. In other words, in 1 month, there were 23,000 attempts to get a firearm by a person who was not allowed to possess one under our current law. And it is a federal crime for anyone to lie in an attempt to get a firearm, which is what I suspect most people try to do. I'd like to know from you, how many of these March block sales were investigated?
I sent out a directive that we should start prosecuting to the extent we can these lie and try cases. Previously, we hadn't really been pursuing them.
Okay, so I take that as a no. I just have one
No,
more thing to say.
well,
Sir,
I'm
my
saying
time
we
is
are
up.
pursuing those cases.
My time is up. I take that as a no. Unfortunately, this fits a larger pattern of your administration neglecting the health and safety of Americans. From health care to gun violence, this administration is failing to keep my constituents and people all over the country healthy and safe. I demand better. Americans demand better. I want you to provide the answers that you are either unwilling to provide us or don't have answers to this committee, because these are relevant questions and we need to have answers from you. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlelady...
Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
For what purpose? For what purpose does the gentleman seek...
For months, you've tried to get the Attorney General to come. He's here. Why don't you let him speak? Why don't you let him answer the questions?
The gentleman is not...
Time after time. if you want the Attorney General to come, at least let him answer the questions and the accusations made against him.
The gentleman's rudeness is not recognized.
Rudeness
Rudeness is on the other side.
Mr. Stanton is...
Time after time, you refuse to let the Attorney General of the United States answer the questions posed to him.
Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Well, maybe the last few witnesses will actually let the Attorney General speak.
Attorney General.
Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Attorney General, thank you very much for being here. Since the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, those who have sought to suppress the minority vote concealed their intentions. The suppressors suggest that they were really out to advance some altruistic goals, such as election security. But history has proven that those allegations and those rationalizations were lies designed only to fend off legal challenges. It was a dirty little secret, and those who aimed to suppress the minority vote never dared to say it out loud. But not Donald Trump. He didn't even try to keep it a secret. He just blurted it out. He said he will lose the 2020 election if more Americans are able to vote. That's one reason why this president needed a fixer at the Department of Justice. From letting Russia off the hook to rewarding Roger Stone. Mr. Barr, you've proven not only very willing, but I have to admit, very able. More than a year ago, this committee heard testimony about a resurgence of discriminatory voting practices, certain states making it more difficult to vote. These practices include unnecessarily strict photo ID requirements and the abuse of signature match requirements to reject absentee ballots. Despite that, your department has a lax approach to enforcing Voting Rights Act. During your tenure, you filed just one case to do so. But the DOJ has done nothing to block the suppression practices we heard about over a year ago before this committee. And to your credit, Mr. Barr, you warned us. You told the New York Times Magazine earlier this spring that the DOJ's role in protecting the right to vote would be limited this year and that it would be up to the states to police themselves. Isn't that right? Yes or no?
I don't recall saying that, but if you say it's in the article.
It's in the New York Times article from just last month. In that same news story, you said it would be up to the voters to referee the election. Is that right? Yes or no?
I don't remember the context of that, frankly. Was I talking about foreign influence?
No, sir. I'll submit it for the record. You'll have a chance to review it and submit additional testimony if you desire to. Someday, when we have more time, you'll have to explain to me how a person whose right to vote is denied by a discriminatory practice can referee an election.
That doesn't sound.
But I digress. It troubles me that you have not been consistent in your approach. As the Attorney General, you have stood down on discrimination and allowed states to make it harder to vote. But you have used the DOJ as a sword when attempts have been made to make it easier to vote. Voting rights advocates in South Carolina and Alabama sought to prevent Americans from choosing between voting and risking their health by making it easier and safer to complete an absentee ballot during the pandemic. But your DOJ intervened to try to block that accommodation. Mr. Barr, did you discuss either of those cases with the president? Yes or no?
No.
The American people.
I don't even know. What two cases are you talking about?
Cases in which...
Tell me the name of the cases.
I don't have the name of the cases.
Where
South
were
Carolina and Alabama. You'll have a chance to comment after your testimony is done here today. The American people have good reason to believe that you will continue to use your authority to carry out the president's wishes to suppress the vote. And there are fears that you and the president are laying the foundation to interfere with the upcoming election, specifically with vote by mail, as my colleagues have previously noted, because both of you have advanced false conspiracy theories about mail-in voting. And I hope we can put some of those fears to rest here today. Mr. Barr, can you commit to the American people that you will not interfere with the decisions of state and local authorities to use vote by mail and absentee ballots in the 2020 elections? That's a yes or no question.
Well, I think the federal government has very limited ability to get involved in this, but I'm not going to give up whatever ability we have to ensure the integrity of the election. I've never, my observation was simply that it would inject some uncertainty into the election process, and it opens up the potential of fraud, and I think the integrity of our elections is very important.
The president has suggested that only votes counted on election day should be what matters, meaning that if a voter casts a legal ballot on or before election day, but that ballot is not counted on election day, it shouldn't count at all. So I want to ask you again about your commitment to ensuring that every vote is counted. If, in this upcoming November election, the president asks you to intervene and try to stop states from counting legal ballots after election day, will you do the right thing and refuse? Yes or no?
I will follow the law.
You won't say no, sir?
I'll follow the law.
It's very disappointing.
If a state has a law that says it has to be cast on election day, that's the law.
Will you commit to making sure the Department of Justice does not get involved in a contested election? Yes or no?
I will follow the law.
It is so disappointing that we can't get a clear answer on that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the following items. An item from The Guardian magazine, an embarrassment. Trump's Justice Department goes quiet on voting rights. Second, New York Times magazine, William Barr, state of emergency. Finally, from the Washington Post, Trump's assault on the election integrity forces question, what would happen if he refused to accept the loss?
Without objection, the material will be based.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record,
Without objection.
a member of the Judiciary Committee, following the law,
Without objection.
should be something a member of the Judiciary Committee knows.
The gentleman
is
will
pretty darn
suspend-
clear.
The gentleman will suspend. Without objection, the material will be entered into the record. Ms. Dean is recognized.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, could we take a 5-minute break?
Dean is recognized.
Could we take a 5-minute break, Mr. Chairman?
No.
That's a common courtesy,
Ms. Dean is
Mr. Chairman,
recognized.
of every witness.
I waited an hour for you this morning. I haven't had lunch. I'd like to take a 5-minute break.
Mr. Attorney General, we are almost finished. We're going to be finished in a few minutes. Otherwise, we can certainly take a break, but.
You're class act.
Okay.
Yeah.
After this, if you still
Well,
want, we'll have a break.
No, he wants a break now.
You want it now?
And you just
Fine.
mentioned
Committee-
rudeness.
committee
I
will
think we're
stand-
seeing it on display. Let's let
Committee
the
will
Attorney
stand
General
in
have a
recess.
break.
Committee will stand in recess now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The committee will reconvene. Ms. Dean is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Attorney General Barr. I'd like to return and describe or discuss some different issues regarding June 1st and Lafayette Square, where, as you know, peaceful protesters had gathered over days and hours to discuss civil rights, to discuss the heinous murder of George Floyd, and to call for equality and justice. When asked about the use of force displayed in the video against the protesters at Lafayette Square, you stated that your attitude was, quote, get it done. Let's look at what you got done. If you'll take a look at the timeline we have compiled, we see that you were spotted in Lafayette Square at 6:10 p.m. that Monday evening. The president was scheduled to speak in the Rose Garden at 6:15. The park police began to disperse protesters at roughly 6:33. President Trump started his speech at 6:43 and finished at 6:50. So by 7:01, when the president was ready to walk across the street to take a photo in front of St. John's Church, the square was cleared and ready for him to go. Am I correct?
Yes.
The timing is clear. Multiple local officials also confirmed the point of clearing the square. One safety official said it was as if the park police's plan to move the perimeter had been, quote, hurried up when the president needed to walk to church. And just today, Congress heard testimony from Adam DeMarco, a National Guard officer deployed at Lafayette Square, confirming that he expected the square to be cleared after the curfew, after 7 p.m.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Adam DeMarco, National Guard. In
Well-
the afternoon, I didn't have a question for you, sir. In the afternoon, you told us that you learned of the president's interest in crossing the square to go to the church. Is it your opinion, Mr. Barr, that clearing protesters from Lafayette Square, which local officials were told to hurry up moments before the president's photo op with a borrowed Bible in front of a church, was coincidence? Is this timing coincidence?
I believe it is, yes. It's not post hoc ergo propter hoc, is that what you're
Familiar
saying?
with the Latin. In a related matter, when asked about the use of pepper bombs fired...
It wasn't a coincidence in this set, if you would permit me, Congresswoman. Okay? As I said, I use the analogy of MacArthur at Leyte Golf.
We heard
Okay?
that. Thank
Yeah?
you. I'll reclaim
Okay,
it.
so
Mr. Attorney General?
he couldn't have walked...
Said coincidence. Fine. We'll assume that that was all coincidence. In a related
I've
matter,
already
when asked
explained that
about-
it had been planned all day.
Mr. Attorney General, the time is mine. We've waited a long time for you to come here. The time is mine.
You've waited to talk to me like this? You didn't need to wait
When
so
asked
long.
about the use of pepper bombs fired at Americans in Lafayette Square, you said, quote, "No, there were no chemical irritants. Pepper spray is not a chemical irritant. It's not chemical," quote.
Well, everything is chemical. I was referring to a dichotomy,
Actually,
in these kinds of things between
Mr.
chemical
Attorney General,
compounds and naturally occurring
Mr.
substances.
Attorney General, reclaiming my time, there are rules by which we operate here. I would ask you to respect them. Take a look at the screen. I've placed on this screen for reference, as you are aware, how your department describes pepper balls used on Americans in Lafayette Square. A 2009 Justice report noted that the pepper ball, quote, "system's accuracy and accompanying blunt trauma impact made it an ideal chemical dispensing system." So while you, in a quote, said it's not chemical, you today confirm it is chemical, and you're aware of your department's policy, are you not?
What policy?
The one I've just provided to you.
What does it say? What's the policy?
Well, I showed it to you. Finally, whether or not you authorized it at the time, perhaps you weren't listening.
I didn't see the policy. What was the policy
Clearly
in
you weren't
there?
listening. Fine. Whether or not you authorized the use of pepper balls. What? I did not ask you a question yet, sir.
Well, no,
I
well,
ask you to please refrain from interrupting me. We watched horrifying videos played across the news and social media showing that these chemical irritants were used on protesters. So yes or no, and this is a yes or no, sir, have you begun an investigation of the use of excessive force in Lafayette Square?
Well, I think the IG is looking at everything related to, the anti-rioting.
So the answer is yes, you are investigating.
The
By
IG
way
is
of an
investigating it.
Okay, we'll hope that he does not get fired. Tragically, what happened in Lafayette Square is no longer an isolated incident. Use of chemical irritants has been used in more than 90 cities. My colleague showed you the video of the Navy vet being pepper sprayed and beaten, his bones broken. Whether or not you thought this was appropriate at the time, have you now called for law enforcement to stop using these chemical irritants on protesters? Yes or no?
Pepper spray?
Yes.
No.
No?
I think it's a very important non-lethal option.
For protesters?
No,
Sir,
for rioters.
That was my question, for protesters.
No, for rioters.
Yes. Sir, America was founded on the principles of free speech.
When people resist
Excuse
law
me.
enforcement, they're not peaceful.
Reclaiming my time. I'm surprised at your lack of respect for a member of Congress.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
Mr. Barr, good afternoon. I'm glad that you mentioned Latin America a little bit earlier. You know, many of my constituents that I represent in Florida fled to America from countries that use deadly force to stifle speech, and they used armed forces to suppress dissenting voices. They cherish our Constitution, as other Americans have done for generations, because of the incredible freedoms and rights that being an American citizen gives to all of us. It's extremely personal to me because you probably know that my roots are in Ecuador, but I live by the American Constitution. And it's true that those who weren't fortunate enough to always have these rights and freedoms sometimes cherish them even more than those who have always had them. When they see photos from Portland, they don't see the American ideal or the America that they know. They actually see and are reminded what they left behind. You would agree with me on that? Are you listening, Mr. Barr?
Well, I wasn't sure.
Take a look at this video.
Who was the subject of that last sentence?
Just, you know, when
Who
you see,
honor- who-
look at these videos for 1 second. We have seen violence in Venezuela at the hands of Maduro, firing tear gas at protesters and using brutal tactics to crush demonstrations. That's what we see from dictators on both the left and the right. But it's hard to distinguish these photos from those events and from the videos that we've seen by U.S. federal police in Portland tear gassing and breaking the bones of a peacefully protesting U.S. Navy veteran. Very similar. So, Mr. Barr, how do you restore the confidence of my constituents in the values of this country when every night on television they're seeing these images of violence used against the peaceful protesters? We all denounce violence. How do you restore the trust in our democracy?
I think that the force is being deployed against rioters or in situations where protesters are not following police directions.
Most of the protests have been peaceful, Mr. Barr. You know that. You know that. You're just using language for political purposes, just like my colleagues across the aisle. Let me just go now to one of the most important topics facing our nation right now, healthcare. You know, in my district, we have close to 100,000 people that get their health insurance through the ACA. 19,000 of them are living with serious pre-existing conditions. And yet you are working to strip their health care at the worst possible moment, when the coronavirus is killing thousands of people in my state. In Miami-Dade County and in Monroe counties that I represent, do you know how many people have died from COVID-19?
No, I don't.
1,410 people. You were at the White House on March 23rd when President Trump said Governor DeSantis was doing an incredible job. Do you agree that Governor DeSantis is doing an incredible job?
Well, I have no reason not to believe that.
Well, Florida now has more cases than in China.
Well, did
And
Cuomo,
in fact,
do
we
an
have
incredible
Florida,
job in New York?
Unfortunately, and I'm not proud to say this, in Florida we have more cases than most countries combined around the world. So no, he is not doing an incredible job. You push states to open too soon. You threaten states with lawsuits.
I didn't ask states to open. I didn't ask states to open.
You threaten with lawsuits for those states that wanted to have stay-at-home orders, Mr.
For things
Barr.
like church.
We have the facts. I'm going by the facts.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
And now the country, the United States of America, has more than 4.3 million COVID cases alone. You, Mr. Barr, and President Trump, working together, are letting my constituents down. And it's something that you are going to have to live with. What am I supposed to say to my constituents when they ask me if the government has done everything in its power to protect their loved ones from dying? You tell me, Mr. Barr, what am I supposed to tell them?
I would tell them that managing this kind of thing requires a lot of difficult choices and weighing different consequences.
I'm not going to lie. I am not going to lie to my constituents. I am going to tell them that President Donald Trump and the Attorney General, working together, are not following health guidelines. They're letting Americans die needlessly because of political reasons. That is what I will tell them, Mr. Barr. Thank you. And one last question, if I can.
In our system.
Under oath, do you commit to not releasing any report by Mr. Durham before the November election?
No.
You don't commit to that?
No.
So you won't go by Department of Justice policy that you won't interfere in any political investigations before the November election?
We're not going to interfere. In fact, I've made it clear I'm not going to tolerate
But under oath, you're saying that you do not commit to not releasing a report by Durham?
I'm not going to, any report will be, in my judgment, not one that is covered by the policy and would disrupt the election.
The time of the general.
I've already made it clear that neither
You would go
candidate
against
is
your own Department of Justice policy, Mr. Barr.
Why don't you tell me what that policy is?
Oh, I have it right here.
Well, actually,
Do you want me to repeat it for you?
no, I know what the policy is.
The time of the
Okay.
gentlelady.
Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. I yield
Go ahead.
back.
Chairman.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentlelady.
Point of order,
Gentlelady
Mr.
yields
Chairman.
back. What purpose does the gentleman seek?
Is it permissible for a member of this committee to accuse the sitting Attorney General of the United States of murder? Because that's what we just heard. Those words need to be struck from this record. This is outrageous.
The members control the time.
Mr. Chairman.
To say whatever they want? What about rules of decorum?
Mr. Chairman.
Escobar is
Mr. Chairman, I actually have a clarification. Mr. Chairman.
Escobar
Mr. No, this, I just.
Escobar is recognized.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Chairman.
was the video played by the previous member, was that a video of things that happened in the United
Escobar-
States or in Venezuela? I just want a
Gentleman is not-
clarification. What was the video?
The gentleman is not stating a cognizable point of order. Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, the administration, against the constitutional text, historical precedent, and DOJ's own memo, is trying to exclude undocumented persons from the census, an action that harms American lives and immigrant communities, and American communities. Here's an example. Many American children are living with an undocumented parent or relative. This change in the census means that those children, American children, would receive less money for programs like the National School Lunch Program, Head Start, or the State Children's Health Insurance Program. A simple yes or no, please, Mr. Barr. Are you comfortable with a decision that would punish American children and immigrant communities in this way?
I don't make the policy. I provide legal advice on legal issues. So as
Okay.
both to this issue and the issue of the
Thank you, Mr.
ACA, the
I didn't
question
ask you
presented
about
to the
ACA,
department
Mr.
is
Barr.
the law.
Reclaiming my time, sir. Mr. Barr, a simple yes or no. Does the Constitution say that only citizens should be counted in the census?
No.
Correct. It does not. In fact, the framers of the 14th Amendment explicitly confronted this question, and it provides that persons in each state be counted. I'll move on.
Well, they wouldn't have,
Among
they
many
wouldn't have
other-
confronted
sir,
it
there's no
because there were
question
no
yet.
illegal aliens.
Among
at the
many
time.
other things, I'm alarmed by your department's refusal to comply with and implement key Supreme Court rulings. On June 18th of this year, the Supreme Court, in an opinion authored by Chief Justice Roberts, ruled that the Trump administration's attempt to rescind DACA was arbitrary and capricious, and required the administration to process new DACA applications. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling, 0 DACA applications have been processed. That's not the only Supreme Court decision your administration has ignored. In 2017, your department issued a memo stating that transgender workers were not protected by civil rights laws. The Supreme Court struck that down too.
No, I'm
In
sorry.
both
What
the
we had
DACA
said
sir,
was
there's
the
no question for you
64
yet.
Act did
Excuse
not
me.
extend to.
Reclaiming my time, sir. In both DACA, the DACA and transgender decisions, your department has yet to comply. Yes or no? Will the department implement the Supreme Court's DACA and transgender rulings?
Yes, I think we are.
The DACA ruling?
Yes.
You are now processing DACA applications?
I think what we're trying to do now is restore the administrative process. And
Sir,
I think
okay,
DHS has put out a rule. I
reclaim
think
my
DHS put out a rule
Thank
today.
you, sir. Sir, earlier you testified.
At least that's what I was told.
You testified that you discussed the president's reelection campaign with him. Does the president tell you what he thinks the winning issues for him would be in his reelection?
I'm not going to discuss my discussions with the president.
I'm not asking you to divulge anything private or classified.
Well, I think my
Does
discussions with the president
mention-
are confidential.
Okay. Have you?
But it
and the
shouldn't
president-
surprise you at an election year, the topic of the election comes up.
Well, it surprises me that the DOJ has become so politicized. That's what surprises me. Sir, have you and the president ever discussed the fact that anti-immigrant and anti-LGBTQ policies excite his base?
No.
You've never had that conversation. No. He's never told you that his anti-immigrant policies, his anti-LGBTQ policies gin up his base.
I haven't discussed that with him, but I assume the immigration, I think a lot of his base does care about immigration policy.
Does that motivate some of the work that you do?
Like what work?
Well, for example, your enthusiasm for...
That position was taken on the transgender that you're talking about was taken before I arrived in that litigation, I believe.
And you can reverse it any day. And my question was whether you...
No, it was a
were going to
legal
reverse
question
it.
as to whether the 64 Act extended to transgender. I think it was...
I'm running out of time, sir. One more question. You keep telling us that you're not aware of the president's tweets. Are you aware that your department has stated that the president's tweets are official White House statements?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
I don't pay
So it
attention
goes
to the
back
tweets unless they're brought to
2017.
my attention.
Okay, Mr. Barr, thank you so much for being here today. I want to remind you of something you probably don't remember, but some months ago, you actually were outside my office. You were coming out of my neighbor, Doug Collins' office. I tapped you on the shoulder, and in a friendly reminder, I handed you a copy of the Constitution, and I asked you to please help us defend the Constitution. There's nothing more dangerous to our republic than an attorney general who refuses to uphold his oath, refuses to uphold and defend the Constitution, and swears allegiance to just one person, Donald Trump. Sadly, that's where we are today.
My loyalty is the
Mr. Chairman, I
Constitution.
yield back.
That's why I came into government.
Gentlelady yields
The
back.
lady just accused him of not adhering to his
Gentlelady-
oath of office. Let him
gentlelady-
talk. Holy, she
gentlelady-
just accused the Attorney General of the United States not adhering to his oath. Let the gentleman
gentlelady will-
speak.
Even worse.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentlelady yields back. The ranking member asks whether the video shown by the gentlelady from Florida took place in the U.S. or in Ecuador.
No, Venezuela.
And that, sir, the U.S. or Venezuela. And that, sir, is precisely the point. This concludes today's hearing.
She was
We
making
thank the Attorney
my
General
point was
for
it was
participating.
Venezuela.
We thank the Attorney General for participating without objection. All members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written records for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.